Allison knew that Ella didn't like her. If Ella couldn't even tolerate her only child, Alex, what chance did Allison, who was merely her daughter-in-law, have? Her last hope had been her pregnancy. Of course, now she realized how foolish it was to think that her mother-in-law would suddenly become a loving grandmother. But back then, that version of events had somehow seemed entirely plausible. And now, here she was, alone, pregnant, walking down a dark street at night with no money or phone, utterly clueless about her whereabouts. "Hey," came a hoarse, drunken voice from somewhere. Allison looked around in fear, instinctively covering her belly with her hands. "Wait for me." "Where are you going?" Further down the sidewalk, the staggering silhouette went in the opposite direction, still calling out to the person who had vanished into the darkness. "I'm in the clear," Allison thought, feeling a sticky trickle of sweat run down her right temple. "He didn't notice me." She had just a bit farther to go. It was strange that she had chosen this place as her sanctuary. The house at the end of the street, with its black roof and windows reflecting the glow of streetlights, stood out even during the day, exuding an eerie sense of Gothic antiquity. The area around the house was hidden behind a tall brick fence, making it impossible to see what lay inside. Only the trees peeking over the fence hinted at the existence of some kind of garden within. It also seemed as if no one lived in the house with the black roof, because Allison had never seen anyone enter or exit. However, she was certain that the house wasn't abandoned. Abandoned houses were immediately apparent. The owner was like the soul of the house, not as essential as the roof or foundation, perhaps, but when that soul left the body, it became empty and lifeless, evident at first glance. There was something alive in that mysterious house. There was something about it that drew Allison like a magnet. In the neighborhood where she had moved after her wedding to Alex, everything seemed foreign and unwelcoming. It made sense that the gloomy house would fit right in. Yet, there was an almost mystical attraction emanating from that strange house, prompting her to occasionally detour onto the street during her infrequent walks. And then, the dreams began. Her walks had become infrequent because her mother-in-law was exerting more and more control over her. Allison had almost stopped leaving her, that is, her mother-in-law's house. And then, all of a sudden, the house with the black roof started appearing in her dreams. She was sure she would find her sanctuary there. Suddenly, the baby in her belly kicked. "Hold on, little one," Allison tenderly said to him. "We're almost there." She approached the massive front door made of clearly expensive yet old wood and hesitantly knocked. There was no answer, and she couldn't spot a doorbell. Yielding to some inner instinct, Allison pushed the door. It wasn't locked. "What am I doing?" flashed through her mind for a moment. A pregnant woman sneaking into a stranger's house at night. I could easily be mistaken for a burglar and get hurt. However, her feet were already moving down the dark, wide corridor, and her steps were nearly silent. It seemed there was a thick plush carpet on the floor. Allison didn't even understand what she wanted to find in this house. She only knew it was her refuge. The corridor opened into a large room, illuminated by candlelight emanating from a tall metal candlestick on a table covered with a long white tablecloth. Allison's gaze focused on these details, and at first, she didn't even notice the dark figure sitting in a chair at the far end of the room. "Good evening," the figure said. "Can I help you?" Allison was looking at her reflection and couldn't believe that this was really happening to her. She had just turned 18 a few months ago. What wedding? In the mirror, she saw a fragile, petite, very young girl with big, fearfully wide brown eyes and lightly chestnut curly hair, forming slightly disheveled curls. Her plain, inexpensive dress, just below the knees, resembled a wedding gown only in color, and even that was more of a slightly creamy ivory or ivory hue. The shoes were a bit too big. She had borrowed them from a roommate for the day. "Well, there you go," her neighbor Jennifer said approvingly. "A real bride." Jennifer took a step back to admire her handiwork with the hair. Though Allison's eyes, her current hairstyle resembled something between a well-kept crow's nest and the fleece of an unshorn sheep. Of course, she didn't say that out loud. "Why the long face?" Jennifer asked. Allison shrugged. "It all happened so quickly. I still can't believe it's really happening." Jennifer snorted. "Of course, it happened quickly. You and Alex only met 3 months ago. And look, you're already expecting a baby and getting married," her neighbor said as if nothing unusual had occurred. However, perhaps that was how it was for her. Allison, on the other hand, couldn't quite wrap her head around the events of the past few months. Although, maybe it was because her life wasn't exactly filled with incidents. She didn't know or remember her parents. From the age of 4, she lived in a children's home and attended a boarding school. When she became too old for the children's home and finished school, she enrolled in a sewing school and was provided with a room in the dormitory there. A couple of weeks later, she met Alex at a party with mutual friends, and things just took off. "You have very beautiful eyes," were the first words he said to her. "Thank you," Allison replied. "Will you go out with me?" Just like that. Alex shrugged. There was something bold and strong about him that instantly appealed to Allison. Maybe it was the strong lines of his sturdy jaw or how his thick brows met at such a sharp angle. Or perhaps it was how confidently and decisively he took charge. "Why wait? We don't know each other. Let's get to know each other." Allison opened her mouth to object but changed her mind for some reason. "I'm Alex." He smiled and extended a large hand, which Allison awkwardly shook, feeling the calluses. "I'm Allison." Of course, initially, they didn't date. They hung out together, getting to know each other, for a whole week, and then they started dating as adults should. The speed at which everything was happening left Allison's head spinning. She felt like she had been caught in a whirlpool or quicksand, where every move made her sink deeper. "Are you sure?" Alex asked her after a month. Allison sat on her narrow, hard bed in her small dorm room, hugging herself. She looked at Alex with the eyes of a trapped animal and nodded uncertainly. "I took 2 tests, both positive." He frowned, causing the space between his thick brows to crease even more. "What are we going to do?" Allison timidly asked. "We need to introduce you to my mom," he said. She hadn't expected that response. "Why my mom?" she asked. He shrugged. "You're my girl. You're pregnant. We need to figure out what to do next. Get married, live together, and all that. Well, or maybe we'll discuss other options." He approached the bed, sat down abruptly, and held her shoulders firmly. "I didn't expect things to turn out this way," Allison said. "Neither did I." The next day, Alex took Allison to have dinner with his mother. During their first meeting, Ella even seemed pleasant to Allison. She was a tall, slender woman in her 40s, with bright red dyed hair styled in an elegant updo. She resembled a beautiful stepmother from a modern-day Cinderella fairy tale. "Come in, Allison," Ella said with a beautiful, well-modulated voice, studying the girl with her piercing, slightly slanted dark green eyes. Allison cautiously entered the living room. Alex had lived with his mother in this house his whole life. The house was small, with only 3 rooms, situated in one of the remote parts of the city. Allison wasn't often in other people's homes, but the sternness and coldness of the surroundings struck her as unusual. The cafe tables and chairs were remarkable for their strictness and symmetry, and the hostess of the house matched them perfectly. Her thoughts and words were clear, firm, direct, and uncompromising. Ella calmly looked at Alex and then at Allison and said, "Tomorrow, you submit an application to the registry office. You'll get married in a month. You'll live here." It wasn't stated as a question or a proposal. It was more like a fact. "Okay, Mom," Alex replied. To Allison's surprise, she noticed that Alex had suddenly transformed from a strong, confident man into a meek little boy. As for her, no one had asked for her opinion. She opened her mouth to say something, but at that moment, Ella turned to her and asked the first question. "Do you have a lot of things in your dormitory?" "Not much," Allison replied in surprise, forgetting what she had wanted to say. Perhaps it was about everything happening too fast, about her not being ready for this, about her not knowing Alex at all, about not being ready to be a mother, and something else, something very important. However, when Ella looked at her, Allison's own thoughts vanished like smoke. The next day, they went to the registry office together with Ella. Allison filled out the paperwork as if in a daze, signed her name, and hardly heard that she would need to return in a month to confirm her initial intention. She spent that month in the dormitory, and for a while, it almost felt like her pregnancy, meeting her future mother-in-law, and going to the registry office were just a dream. But as the day approached, she grew more nervous. Allison also remembered her wedding day poorly. In fact, it was difficult to call it a wedding. She and Alex simply arrived at the appointed time, listened to the registrar's speech about love, family, and the future cell of society, and signed the documents. The registrar's words went in one ear and out the other for the girl. It was only when they were leaving the registry office that a fleeting thought crossed Allison's mind that she had done something irreversible. "Let's go get your things," Alex said. "Why?" Allison didn't understand. "Why? Now you're my wife, and you'll live with us." "Right. I forgot." Alex chuckled. "It's okay. You'll get used to it soon." She didn't get used to it. On the very first morning, she realized that her life had changed. Ella woke her up an hour earlier than Allison used to for school. "You need to make breakfast," her mother-in-law declared. "Now you're a married woman, and it's your duty." Allison silently went to the kitchen. "What time do your classes end today?" "At 4. "Excellent. You'll have time to prepare dinner." Allison nodded. "How do you fry eggs?" Ella suddenly exclaimed. The spatula slipped from Allison's hands and clattered to the floor in surprise. "You'll wake up Alex ahead of schedule," she muttered. Allison picked up the spatula with trembling hands and carried it to the sink to wash it. "He doesn't like it when it's overcooked," her mother-in-law added dryly. Then, just as suddenly, Ella seemed to soften. "Sweetie, please understand me correctly," she said. "This has all happened very unexpectedly for all of us. I'm worried about you and Alex, and I have very little time to teach you to be independent before the baby is born." Allison nodded. "I understand." She timidly looked up at her mother-in-law. Ella was smiling, but her eyes still remained cold. Then Allison recalled this first morning in her future mother-in-law's house many times. It was the first hint that their family life would not go as smoothly as people who marry at the age of 18 might hope. However, other signs followed this one. Most of all, Allison was surprised by how abruptly Alex had changed, leaving no trace of the bold, confident guy she had met. He was silent and seemed hostile toward his mother, as if he were constantly expecting an attack and was ready to defend himself. However, he never contradicted her, argued, or defended Allison when Ella regularly scolded her. It seemed like there was some unspoken agreement between him and his mother. "I won't bother you, and you won't bother me." But nevertheless, everything always happened the way Ella wanted it to. Allison kept telling herself to endure it, believing that she and Alex would eventually move into their own apartment. However, with each passing day, the situation felt more like a strange, surreal dream. She realized that she didn't know who Alex really was. She didn't like what she was learning about him now. She understood that her pregnancy and marriage had been rushed decisions. If it weren't for Ella, Allison would likely have acted differently. She also saw that she seemed unnecessary to Alex. He was burdened by her presence and showed no interest in the future child. Sometimes, strange thoughts crept into Allison's mind that he had purposely brought her into this house to torment her with Ella. Despite not wanting to be too critical, her mother-in-law couldn't be called a kind woman. At first glance, she made a fantastic impression. Beautiful, well-groomed. Sometimes Allison even thought that Ella was too good for the surroundings and the neighborhood they lived in. She had no idea where Ella worked. Her mother-in-law had an unpredictable schedule. She could stay at home for days and then suddenly get ready late at night, returning by morning. Ella had money, that was clear. Her clothing, cosmetics, and shoes appeared quite expensive, although she didn't always flaunt it. Sometimes Allison felt like her mother-in-law led a kind of double life. One day, she would leave the house dressed in a smart, expensive dress with elegant makeup and a styled hairdo. And the next day, when she and Allison had to go to the hospital, she'd wear a tasteless, flower-patterned dress and apply makeup as if she were a market vendor. But when it came to the baby, Ella was impeccably precise and caring. She attended all of Allison's medical appointments, ensuring she completed all the necessary tests and examinations. Ella bought vitamins and carefully questioned the doctors about the progress of Allison's pregnancy and the baby's development. "In a month, you should take academic leave," she told Allison during dinner one day. "Why?" Allison asked, surprised. "It's still too early. I thought you'd study for a while and leave, maybe 2 weeks before the due date." "Are you out of your mind, girl? Do you realize the strain this will put on the baby?" "No, you're taking leave in a month. You need to rest." Allison looked at Alex, hoping he would say something, but her husband, who had been silently eating throughout the conversation, just lowered his gaze even further into his plate and ate more earnestly. Of course, the larger her belly grew, the harder it became to attend classes. Allison quickly got tired, increasingly wanting to sleep and lie down, and felt less and less motivated to study. But at the same time, her education was the only refuge from Ella, and by going on academic leave, she would be completely under her mother-in-law's control. "I don't want to take leave so early," she replied, summoning all her willpower and avoiding looking her mother-in-law in the eye. "I'm feeling fine, and I don't want to miss so much school. I'm still capable of attending." "Allison," Ella's voice became as hot as molten metal. "You will go on academic leave in a month." Allison felt something inside her tighten. Ella was staring at her without breaking eye contact, like a snake hypnotizing a rabbit. Suddenly, her tone completely changed. "Allison, I'm telling you, it's not for nothing. Do you remember what the doctor said? That everything is fine?" Allison weakly replied, feeling her resistance crumble. "For now," her mother-in-law continued sweetly, "the baby is doing fine, but your iron levels are a bit low. You have swelling, and your blood pressure isn't stable. You don't want these issues to affect the baby's health in the future, do you?" Allison shook her head in disagreement. "Well, that's just great," Ella concluded. For a split second, Allison entertained the thought of how wonderful it would be if something did happen to the baby. Then she would be free from the clutches of the formidable and mysterious Ella with her incomprehensible authority, free from the passive Alex, free from this unwanted marriage, and free from these austere rooms in this dreadful neighborhood. In that moment, she felt a faint inner nudge. Allison instinctively placed her hand on her belly, feeling a burning sense of shame. How could she have had such thoughts? Was the child to blame? It was already inside her. No one had asked it to come into the world. It was living and growing inside her, and as a mother, it was her duty to ensure it would grow up happy. Allison tried to improve her relationship with Alex. After seeing his true, passive nature, his fear of his mother, and his disinterest in Allison, their interactions had dwindled to exchanging necessary phrases like "pass the salt" or "let's have dinner." Now, she decided to make an effort to get to know the father of her future child better. "Maybe we could go somewhere tomorrow," she asked one Friday evening as she and Alex were getting ready for bed. "Go where?" he asked. "To the movies, for example, or just take a walk." "Why?" He turned and looked at her with genuine confusion in his eyes. Allison suddenly thought that this was how he would look at a vacuum cleaner or a cupboard if they suddenly started demanding attention and dates instead of fulfilling their functions. "What's wrong with that?" she asked. To this, Alex had no objections. He shrugged. "Okay." Then he turned to face the wall. Allison felt lonely and unnecessary. At that moment, the baby in her belly nudged her again, and she thought, for the baby's sake, she should give it a try. Fortunately, Ella wasn't home in the morning. Allison woke up early, prepared Alex's favorite breakfast, and greeted him when he emerged from the bedroom. "Good morning," she said. He looked at her skeptically. "Good, what's this?" he asked. He approached the table, examined the plate closely, and seemed to brighten up. "Did you make this for me?" "Yes." "Thank you." He didn't utter another word, and Allison feared he might say he had other commitments and couldn't spend time with her today. However, Alex spoke up on his own. "So, will you do the dishes, and then we'll go for a walk?" "Yes," Allison replied with enthusiasm. The walk went well, even though they spent most of the time in silence. "Can I ask you something?" Allison finally mustered the courage. "Go ahead," Alex replied. "Why have I never heard about your father? What happened to him?" Alex clearly didn't expect such a question and let out a strange sigh. "There's not much to tell. I don't really know. He left when I was very young." "Do you remember him?" "Very vaguely. I think he had dark hair. He was tall and thin. I think he used to pick me up and toss me into the air." "Oh, wow. I don't even remember anything about my own father. So, what happened to him?" "It's hard to say. It's like he was there, and then he was gone. He abandoned you, I guess. I'm not entirely sure. There's one strange memory, but I'm not sure if it was real. Can you share it?" "Oops," Allison suddenly exclaimed louder than she intended. The baby had moved very forcefully. Alex looked at her belly. "Can I touch it?" "Yes." He reached out carefully, and Allison guided his hand to where the baby was moving. She realized that throughout her pregnancy, her husband had never shown interest in such moments. She looked at Alex's face, which expressed some surprise and perhaps regret. "It's moving quite a lot," he finally said cautiously, and almost reluctantly withdrew his hand. "Let's sit down for a while," Allison suggested, nodding towards a bench. "Sure." They sat down next to each other. "Will you tell me the story?" Allison asked. "Which one?" Alex inquired. "About your father leaving. The one you don't remember, whether it was real or not." Alex frowned. "All right. I haven't told anyone this, not even my mom." "Wow. I don't remember how old I was at the time. Maybe 4, 5, or 6. It was summer, and it was nighttime. I remember I couldn't sleep because there was a thunderstorm. Normally, I wasn't scared of thunderstorms, but that night it was particularly loud and intense. I even thought about going to my parents' bedroom, but what stopped me was knowing how my mom would react." At this point, Alex's face contorted with pain. She would have said, "Alex, you're a big boy now. Aren't you ashamed to still be sleeping with your parents?" "A big boy," Allison interjected. "But you said you were either 4, 5, or 6. Alex sadly smiled. "I was always a big boy in my mom's eyes, for as long as I can remember. Anyway, I didn't sleep. I listened to the thunder, and I thought I was a big boy who wasn't afraid of anything." "And you didn't go to your parents?" "I wanted to. I got up and started walking towards their room, but then I heard strange sounds." "Sounds?" "Yes, like shouting, as if my mom and dad were arguing. There was also a loud bang. I'd say now it sounded like a gunshot, but it could have been just a thunderclap or a window slamming shut." "Were you scared then?" "I suppose." Alex sighed and ran his fingers through his hair. "I don't know if that memory was real, if I made it up, or if it was a dream, but it's as if after that, my dad disappeared from my life." Allison sighed. She carefully moved closer to him and gently took his hand. Alex didn't object. They sat like that for about 30 seconds, and then he suddenly stood up. "It's time to go home," he said. "All right." Allison thought that maybe things would improve now. It was hard to tell. Did their conversation during the walk affect Alex's feelings towards her? In the presence of his mother, he had been equally indifferent and cold towards his wife. Nevertheless, Allison didn't resist. She understood that it was easier to go with the flow around Ella for the time being, and decided not to assert herself. But in those rare moments when they were alone with Alex, something changed. He might ask how she was feeling, gently touch her belly. Sometimes they watched TV together, and once he even helped her with the dishes. Allison began to relax a bit and allowed herself to plan for the future. She resolved not to act hastily, gradually grow closer to her husband, and persuade him to move away from Ella. Allison even took an academic leave without any argument so that Ella wouldn't suspect the impending rebellion. However, life had one more blow in store for her. Allison had just returned home from university. There was chaos in the house. An enormous bag half filled with belongings was sitting on the couch. "What's going on?" Allison asked. "They're drafting Alex into the army," Ella calmly said, as if nothing unusual had happened. "What?" Allison asked, not believing her ears. Surely, this had to be a joke. It couldn't be real. Ella must be trying to upset her. But at that moment, Alex emerged from the bedroom. He had some clothes in his hands. One look at him was enough for Allison to understand that it was true. Her husband gazed at her with a guilty expression. "You've known about this for a while, haven't you?" She almost didn't ask, but rather stated firmly. He looked away, embarrassed. "Yes." She nodded, feeling tears welling up in her eyes. "When are you leaving?" "Tomorrow." "So soon?" He continued packing his things, turning his back to Allison as if she no longer existed. In the evening, they all had dinner together for the last time. Strangely, Allison began to realize that her husband didn't look upset at all. On the contrary, she was willing to swear that he was happy. It was evident that Alex was trying to contain his emotions in front of his mother, but a sense of joy still subtly revealed itself in the impatience with which he quickly wielded his fork, glancing at the bag on the couch and the clock on the wall. Could it be that Alex found it so difficult to be here that he was willing to go anywhere, even the army, just to get away from them? Allison couldn't quite explain her own feelings. On the one hand, she felt like crying, as if her only glimmer of hope for a brighter future was leaving, and she would be left alone with her mother-in-law for an entire year. On the other hand, and Allison fully understood this, she wouldn't miss Alex. The fleeting feelings she had developed for him a few months ago after they met had faded. If it weren't for the wedding and the child she was carrying, she would have nothing holding her here. The farewell at the train station was incredibly awkward and strange. Other families surrounded them, and Allison could clearly see how they stood out. There were girlfriends, wives, sisters, mothers, and grandmothers. They cried, hugged their sons, husbands, and brothers, demanding daily letters or calls whenever possible. The guys, too, mostly looked sad, although they tried not to show it. But their family was truly distinct. Ella, dressed in an oddly mismatched and cheap outfit, as if intentionally choosing items that didn't go together, mechanically dabbed a handkerchief at her perfectly dry, brightly made-up eyes. She discreetly glanced at her wristwatch. Shifting her gaze to her husband, Allison realized that he too was eagerly awaiting the train's departure, lifting his eyes to the large station clock every minute. The three of them seemed to be hastily playing out a rehearsed play, from which the audience was steadily dwindling, so the actors hardly made an effort. "Take care of yourself there," Ella said calmly and evenly. "Okay, Mom. Write letters." "Yes, Mom. Speak up if you need anything. We'll send it." "Of course, Mom." Having said all that was required, Ella shifted her gaze to her daughter-in-law, as if passing on the lines to her. "Take care of yourself," Allison mechanically repeated after her mother-in-law, unable to come up with anything of her own. Alex nodded. "Take care of the baby." "All right. And yourself too." Allison, hesitantly, reached out to touch her husband but couldn't quite figure out what would be appropriate in such a situation. Her hand hung awkwardly in the air for a couple of seconds before she timidly touched his right sleeve. Alex twitched as if it were a blow or a bite, and also awkwardly and unnaturally placed his hand on Allison's stomach. "When you come back, he'll probably be learning to walk," Allison suddenly said, not knowing why. Alex twitched somehow and, for some reason, glanced at his mother. It seemed to Allison that there was a fleeting smirk on Ella's lips. However, it lasted only a second. "It's time for you to go," Ella said to her son. "Go." He nodded in relief, as if receiving long-awaited permission, and quickly walked towards the open train car door. In that moment, Allison suddenly felt the final realization that from this second onward, she would be utterly alone, left alone with Ella for an entire year. The thin, fragile wall in the form of Alex was departing. "Wait," she cried out and rushed forward. Alex turned around, and in that moment, Allison firmly wrapped her arms around him. Feeling him trembling, her husband cautiously embraced her. "Take care of yourself," he suddenly whispered in a completely different tone into her ear. "And the baby too." After that, Alex pulled away abruptly, without saying a word, turned around, and without looking at either Allison or his mother, walked into the train car. "Let's go." "Allison," Ella's voice rang out. "I'm coming," she said softly. After Alex left, something imperceptibly changed in the house. Although her son didn't seem to have any authority or power over his mother, Ella somehow stopped holding back after his departure. In the first few days, Allison didn't understand what was happening. It was then that she began having strange dreams. It was as if she was running away from Ella's house at night and running down the street until she stumbled upon a house. It looked gloomy from the outside, with a black roof and a high fence, but for some reason, Allison was sure that she would find protection there. Every time, the dream ended at the point where she reached out her hand to the door of that house. Every time she woke up in agony, thinking that she still didn't know what lay behind the massive wooden door. "Allison, wake up," Ella's loud voice would echo. "I'm getting up," Allison would reply. "I'm getting ready for work. Make breakfast." Allison pursed her lips and went to prepare breakfast. Ella seemed to become more active. She started going to her mysterious job more often. In her free time, she either sat in her room and spoke quietly on the phone with someone or accompanied Allison to doctor appointments. "I can go to the hospital myself." Allison tried to fend off Ella's involvement. "What's this news? Don't you like my company?" Ellie asked. Allison felt herself blushing. "No, not at all," she replied timidly. "I just thought." "Don't overthink it," Ella cut her off, flashing her white teeth. Seeing Allison's expression, she softened her tone. "Don't burden your mind with such things. In your condition, you need to relax and focus only on the baby. I'll take care of everything to ensure your pregnancy goes smoothly." Ella was taking care of her. Allison felt like no other pregnant woman had ever seen so many doctors, even though things were going relatively well for her. At some point, Ella decided that budget clinics were not sufficient, and they started going to private doctors. There were no familiar lines and tickets there. On the contrary, they visited small offices late in the evening, and there were usually no other patients nearby. Allison didn't like those doctors. They looked at her strangely, as if she were an object, and they didn't acknowledge her as a person. They only talked to Ella. Allison attributed this to the fact that Ella was the one paying for the appointments, so they considered her the primary party. They didn't say anything to Allison, and after the examination, she waited in the corridor while Ella chatted with the doctors. The more time passed, the more peculiarities in Ella's behavior Allison began to notice. Once, they were sitting in line, this time at a regular clinic. Ella was scrolling for her phone, and Allison was looking at a medical poster while absent-mindedly caressing her belly. Then, her attention shifted to two girls who were talking to each other. They were probably friends or had just met in line a few minutes ago. It was hard to tell. "No, she's definitely not worth the money," the girl in the pale blue sundress said. "Overpriced for the brand," the other girl replied. "I thought so," the small one in the sundress affirmed. "What about the crib? Have you decided?" The first girl asked. "I think my husband's sister will give us hers. Her youngest just turned 4, and they don't plan on having a third," the girl explained. "Oh, that's great when you have relatives like that. It saves you money," her friend commented. "You're right. My 2 older cousins are collecting a ton of baby clothes to give me. They say kids grow so fast. They hardly get a chance to wear anything. They wore some outfits only twice, and it's already time to buy new ones." "Oh, absolutely. Time flies when you have kids," the friend agreed. At first, Allison didn't even understand what drew her attention to that conversation. At that moment, it was their turn, and she and Ella entered the doctor's office. "In 4 or 5 weeks, you'll be giving birth," the tall, slightly plump 50-year-old doctor said cheerfully. She addressed Allison as if she were a small child, as if she had difficulty understanding what was happening. However, in the waiting room, Allison saw many teenage girls who clearly had no idea how they ended up there. Only their rounded bellies indicated they were in the right place. Even though Allison was 18, almost 19, she could easily pass for a high school student. 4 or 5 weeks, Ella sweetly asked, seeking clarification. "Yes," the doctor replied. "Wonderful," Ellie exclaimed. The doctor nodded. "Everything is going well. I think you'll have a natural delivery. I've written down some recommendations for you." She slid a sheet of paper over, which Ella deftly took with a precise movement and placed it in her bag. "Thank you," she said, smiling. Back at home, when Allison entered the apartment and began to reheat lunch, it hit her. The due date was rapidly approaching, and Ella had no plans to prepare the home for the baby. They hadn't bought a crib, a stroller, diapers, or blankets. Stirring the soup, Allison thought that she needed to talk to her mother-in-law about this. "Lunch is ready," she cautiously announced, peering into Ella's room. "I'm coming," Ella replied without even turning around. She was sitting with her back to Allison, studying something on her laptop. Out of the corner of her eye, Allison managed to catch a glimpse of the website's design: palm trees, a beach, smiling gorillas, and people in swimwear. Was her mother-in-law planning a vacation? Then who would help Allison with the baby? Alex wouldn't be back anytime soon. However, she needed to address another issue first. "I've been thinking," Allison began timidly, carefully dipping her spoon into the soup. "It seems we didn't have much time left, and we haven't started buying anything for the baby." "What are you talking about?" Ella raised an eyebrow. Allison felt embarrassed. "You, Ella, haven't been buying anything for my child. A crib, a stroller, diapers, and everything else," she said quietly, lowering her head. "Oh, that," Ella replied. "We'll get to it. You heard the doctor, right? We have more than a month left. You can buy all of that in one day." Allison had her doubts about this. How would she know? After all, she had never bought anything like that before. She didn't even have any friends with children, or friends without children, for that matter. Nevertheless, she mustered the courage to object. "But what if we don't have enough time?" Ella looked at her again, irritation clearly visible on her face. "Don't have enough time," she repeated coldly. "What if labor starts earlier?" Allison persisted. "You heard the doctor, didn't you?" her mother-in-law retorted. "Everything is fine with you. The delivery will be on time. But in the worst-case scenario, I'll buy everything while you're in the hospital." "All right," Allison conceded. And besides, Ella seemed to remember another argument and felt obligated to mention it. "It's considered bad luck to buy things before the due date. Haven't you heard of that?" "I understand," Allison said quietly. Ella nodded satisfactorily. Throughout this time, only one letter arrived from Alex. It was short and to the point. He wrote that he had reached his destination, settled and well, and liked it there. He couldn't provide more details due to the nature of his work. He also mentioned that sending letters was restricted, and they had strict rules about phones, making it impossible to call or message discreetly. At the end of the letter, he expressed hope that everything was going well with Allison and his mother. He didn't inquire about the baby or request more frequent correspondence. In fact, the letter seemed as though it didn't require a response. It was as if, by writing it, Alex had fulfilled some final obligation and was now free. Allison was certain that Ella hadn't even bothered to write a reply. The letter was addressed to her mother-in-law, and she had read it aloud to Allison in the kitchen before neatly folding it back into its envelope and taking it to her room. Besides, even if Allison had wanted to reply herself, she didn't know the address. And to be honest, she didn't really want to. Alex now seemed like a distant and fading past to her. She only remembered their connection when she looked at her growing belly, which was expanding not by days but by hours. "What will happen to us, little one?" Allison often said when she was alone in her room, and the baby began to move. The further along she got, the more often she had these strange dreams where she was running away from Ella and seeking refuge in an unfamiliar, eerie house. After some time, Allison began to realize that something about Ella's behavior scared her. It was unsettling to her that her relationship with her mother-in-law seemed to have improved. Previously, especially when Alex was still here, Ella could be sharp and rude, picking on small things like improperly washed dishes or a floor not swept correctly. Now, it seemed like she didn't care about Allison anymore. Allison used to see that her presence in the house annoyed her mother-in-law, that she was unhappy with her son's choice, and with the fact that Allison was pregnant and dependent on her. But now, Ella had no time for Allison. Allison had transformed from a detested fiancée into a carefully guarded incubator for the baby. At least, the baby was the only thing Ella seemed to notice about Allison. It was the child, not the grandchild. Ella never uttered that word. She never initiated conversations about what they would name the baby, how they would raise it, or anything else related to its arrival. It was as if it would never happen. There was only meticulous monitoring of Allison's and the baby's current health and an inexplicable sense of anticipation tied to it. The anticipation seemed to radiate from Ella. What she was waiting for remained unclear. It definitely wasn't her son returning from the army. As for the birth of her grandchild, it was as if it both did and didn't matter, which was unsettling. According to the forecast, there were 2 weeks left until the due date. Allison constantly felt a vague sense of unease and anxiety that she couldn't explain. She felt fine, and the baby was doing well too. Nevertheless, the feeling that something terrible was about to happen never left her for a moment. There were no more letters from Alex, and strangely, Allison wasn't surprised by this at all. Ella also showed no signs of concern. She was always preoccupied with something, looking at her laptop, making phone calls. And of course, she never brought up the topic of preparing for the baby's arrival. Allison didn't bring it up either anymore. She didn't know how to cope with this sense of impending doom. She had grown up in an orphanage, with no relatives or friends. She didn't know whom to turn to for help. The police. But what would she say? "I have strange, scary dreams, and I feel like something is going to happen, but I don't know what. My mother-in-law is taking care of me and the baby, taking us to private clinics." She also remembered that some of her friends from the orphanage had found their relatives after graduation. Sometimes they were awful people, definitely not worth connecting with, but others had been lucky and found family in the form of aunts, uncles, grandmothers, or cousins. Sometimes Allison wondered if she had someone in this world too. However, under Ella's watchful eye, searching for her family was impossible. Perhaps the only person she could share her anxieties with was her husband. But she didn't even know the address where she could write to him. And even if she did, what would Alex do then? Nothing. Allison couldn't sleep at night, and she didn't know why. Maybe it was because the baby was kicking too hard, or maybe it was the heartburn after dinner. She sat on the bed with her legs drawn up, pondering that she definitely wouldn't fall asleep until morning. Suddenly, she heard footsteps. For some reason, Ella was quietly approaching her door. Forgetting about the aches and everything else, Allison hastily lay down under the covers and closed her eyes. Her heart was pounding like crazy. Her mother-in-law silently cracked the door open and slowly approached. Strange thoughts entered Allison's mind. Ella might hit her, smother her with a pillow, or inject her with a syringe. She curled up under the blanket while simultaneously pretending to be sound asleep. Ella stood there for a while. Then, apparently satisfied with whatever she wanted to see, left, closing the door behind her. After waiting a little longer, Allison cautiously got up and approached the door. She could faintly hear Ella's voice from the corridor. She was clearly on the phone. Allison suddenly realized that she had to listen in on this conversation. She carefully began to open her bedroom door, freezing at the thought that it might creak and give her away. Her intuition told her that eavesdropping wouldn't sit well with Ella. "Yes, she's asleep," Ella said. Allison flinched. She had hoped until the last moment that it was just paranoia and unhealthy fantasies brought on by pregnancy, loneliness, and her dislike for her mother-in-law. According to the forecast, in 2 weeks, Ella continued her conversation with the person on the other end of the line. But judging by her belly, she could give birth any day now. The door creaked. Allison froze, opening it slightly wider than she should have. Ella also fell silent, listening intently. But then, apparently, the person on the other end of the phone asked her something, and she got distracted. "Yeah, no problem, even today." "Well, not today, then tomorrow." What is she talking about? Allison thought. About childbirth. Where would she go? She's always at home. "Yeah, I understand. I won't let her out to any store or on a walk tomorrow." "No, better during the day when all the neighbors are at work." "Yes, that works perfectly." Allison began to cautiously close the door behind her, leaving it slightly ajar, just as it was after Ella closed it. She managed to hear a bit more. "Yes, the full amount up front, and I'll provide documents proving the baby's health." Allison lay in bed and closed her eyes. Her heart was pounding so loudly that she feared Ella might hear the thumping from the adjacent room. It was clear that the conversation had ended. Her mother-in-law got up and headed in the direction of Allison's bedroom again. This time, she didn't enter but stood by the door for a while. Then she left, and from the sounds of it, she went back to her own room. Allison lay there with her eyes closed for a while longer, listening to the sounds of the house. About half an hour passed before she mustered the courage to open her eyes and sit up on the bed. She couldn't believe what she had heard. However, there were no doubts left. She had to run. But where? Where could she run to? One thing was clear. She had very little time left. They would come for her tomorrow during the day, and until then, Ella definitely wouldn't let her out of the house. So, she had to escape now while her mother-in-law slept. Driven by this thought, Allison got dressed and slipped out of her room. The house was quiet, with only the faint hum of the refrigerator somewhere in the kitchen. Allison slowly made her way down the hallway, flinching every time the floor creaked beneath her feet. She put on her shoes carefully, slowly opened the door, and stepped outside. On the street, she quickened her pace, glancing over her shoulder every minute as if Ella were chasing her. "So, how can I help you?" the figure in the depths of the room repeated. "I don't know," Allison replied. "Sorry for bothering you. I didn't know where else to go." "Do you know what kind of house this is?" "No, I've never been here." "Interesting." The person took a few steps forward, and Allison was finally able to see him a bit more clearly. He was a tall, slender man who appeared to be in his 40s or early 50s. He had shoulder-length black hair with sporadic silver strands, thick black eyebrows, and sad but kind blue eyes. His facial features seemed vaguely familiar to Allison. He could even be considered handsome if it weren't for his thinness and a sense of doom and sadness in his eyes. "Oh, so you're pregnant," he exclaimed, "and probably freezing out here." "Not really," Allison replied. "The night is warm." The man waved his hands. "Hurry, come with me to the kitchen." He walked somewhere, and Allison had no choice but to follow him. They arrived in a small but very cozy kitchen. "Please, have a seat," the man said, pointing to a chair. Allison sat down. He went to the stove and put on a kettle. "What's your name?" he asked. Allison, nice to meet you. I'm Jack. Nice to meet you. What type of tea do you drink, Allison? Black, with milk and no sugar. All right. He placed 2 cups of tea with milk on the table, pushing one towards Allison. Then, he took an apple pie out of the fridge. You must be hungry, he said. No, Allison replied, but her stomach betrayed her with a loud growl. She blushed and covered it with her hands. Don't be embarrassed. Jack warmly smiled at her and offered a plate with a slice of pie. Thank you. I lead a rather unconventional schedule, as you might have noticed, which brought you here at 2 in the morning, he explained. Allison blushed. Oh no, it's not your fault. By the way, I usually lock the front door, but apparently, our meeting was destined by fate. Allison shrugged uncertainly. Do you believe in fate, Allison? She looked up at him and gazed into his face. Jack looked at her so kindly that she, for the first time in her life, decided to confide in a stranger. I've had a dream about this house many times. It's always the same. I'm running away from where I was before, and I run into this house. But the dream always ends every time I'm about to open the door. I've never seen what awaits me inside. Jack sadly smiled. Well, now you've seen. Thank you for not kicking me out. There's no need to thank me. Not yet. He stood up. Look, I can just make the bed for you and you can rest. In the morning, if you want, you can leave without any explanations. If you want to talk, we can do that. We can talk now. I'm not in a hurry, Jack said. Allison thought she probably wouldn't sleep now, but she didn't have the strength or desire to share everything that had happened to her at this moment. If you don't mind, I'd like to talk in the morning, she replied. Jack nodded. Then please, stay here for a moment. I'll prepare the bed. He left, leaving Allison alone in the kitchen. She gazed out the window, which now displayed only the darkness of the night and her reflection in the glass. Despite the events of the day not making sense, and as she woke up tomorrow in a place she never could have imagined, she felt safe. It was a long-forgotten feeling, harking back to her distant childhood. For a few minutes, Allison became a little girl again, being cared for by strong, responsible adults. All she needed to do was trust them and relax. Ready? Jack's voice snapped her out of her thoughts. Ready for what? Allison asked, surprised. Your room. Follow me. Following Jack, she ascended a narrow staircase to the 2nd floor. There, she found a small bedroom, equally cozy as the kitchen. Jack had prepared fresh bedding and placed a glass of water on a small wooden table. There was also neatly folded gray fabric, presumably a t-shirt. The bathroom and shower are downstairs, right under the stairs, he said. If you need anything or find it difficult to go downstairs, just call louder. I'll hear you. He turned and walked towards the exit. Thank you, Jack, Allison said. He turned back and shrugged awkwardly. How could I leave a girl in trouble? You clearly need help. Allison was certain she wouldn't be able to close her eyes. However, she fell asleep as soon as her head touched the pillow. When she woke up, she momentarily forgot where she was, feeling a bit startled by the unfamiliar white-gray ceiling above her, and the wooden one, light brown in color. After a minute, the events of the previous day flashed through her mind. They didn't find me, Allison thought. Ella doesn't know where I am, although she's probably already noticed my absence. A cautious knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Yes, Allison replied. Allison, are you awake? Yes. Then good morning. Come downstairs whenever you're ready. I'll start making breakfast. By the way, there are clean towels and a toothbrush in the bathroom. Thank you. Allison decided not to linger. After all, despite his kindness, Jack didn't really know her. He probably had his own responsibilities, perhaps needing to go to work. So she got up, tried to freshen up, and then made her bed. Afterward, she went downstairs to the bathroom. After a shower, washing her face, and brushing her teeth, Allison finally felt like herself again and became more cheerful. She could even smell the scent of food wafting in from the kitchen. It smells delicious, Allison said as she entered the kitchen. My signature bacon and egg breakfast with tomatoes and a cheesy crust, Jack replied. Sounds delicious. Could you pour the tea? Of course, just like yesterday. Yes. I'd like it with milk and without sugar too. Perfect. A simple act like pouring tea calmed Allison down and dispelled her last doubts. As soon as she placed the cups on the table, a demanding meow echoed from below. Allison looked down and saw a large, chubby, ginger cat. "Hello," she said. "Meow," the cat replied. Allison cautiously, as her stomach allowed, sat down and ran her hand over the fat soft fur. It arched its back and puffed up its tail. "He seems to like you." "I like him too. Such a handsome fellow." "Yes, indeed, but he's gotten a bit too plump. It's time to put him on a diet." The cat huffed and meowed irritably. Allison laughed. "Looks like he's not a fan." "Well, can't blame him. But the vet said it's already a severe case of obesity and prescribed a therapeutic diet." Jack retrieved a bag of cat food and poured it into the bowl for the cat. The cat gave the owner a displeased look, then shifted its gaze to Allison, who just shrugged. The cat seemed to sigh and then approached the bowl to start eating. "But it's time for us to have breakfast too," Jack said as he returned to the stove, plating the scrambled eggs and setting them on the table. "It's delicious," Allison said after a few minutes. "I'm glad. I almost forgot what it's like to have someone cook for me. I suddenly realized it's usually my duty." "Oh, I see. Well, I'm glad I could make you happy. You've done so much for me." Jack looked away, somewhat embarrassed. "But this house appeared in my dreams so many times as a safe haven." "Not in vain," Allison said softly, "and I'm ready to talk about everything." He set down his fork and looked at her seriously and attentively. "If anything, you're not obliged to do so. It's all voluntary." Allison nodded. "Thank you for giving me a choice, but I feel like I need to share with someone." "All right. Then let's move to the living room." They cleared away the remnants of breakfast, did the dishes, and then went to the room where Allison had first met Jack. Now, in the daylight, the room appeared very cozy, spacious, and lived in. Allison noticed a bookshelf filled with books, a large old wooden table covered with books, newspapers, magazines, some notebooks, a sofa, and a couple of armchairs. "It's beautiful here," Allison remarked. "But last night, it seemed a bit gloomy to me." "Everything looks better in daylight than at night," Jack replied. They both took a seat. "Go ahead," Jack said. And Allison recounted everything that had been in her life. The orphanage, the brief training at the sewing school, meeting Alex, her pregnancy, marriage, and finally, life with Ella, both before and after her husband's departure, up to yesterday. Jack listened without interruption, his face remaining attentive and serious. "So, I came into this living room, and you started talking to me," she concluded. "Poor girl," he sighed. "How much you must have endured." "Tell me," Allison asked him, "do you think I've gone mad? Do I have paranoia?" He shook his head negatively. "I absolutely don't think so. You and your child were in grave danger. I shudder to think of what could have happened if you hadn't run away. So, you believe me, I'm not crazy." Again, he shook his head. "I must confess something to you, Allison." Goosebumps ran down her spine. She suddenly thought she might have fallen into a trap. What if he was in cahoots with Ella, and her arrival at this house had been planned? "What is it?" she asked, her lips dry, almost whispering. "To some extent, you and I are related." Allison certainly didn't expect that answer. "What does that mean?" "I am Ella's ex-husband, and your husband's father." "What?" Allison couldn't believe what she was hearing. "So we've been living in the same neighborhood all these years, and Alex hardly remembers you at all." "I've been living in this house for several months." "Where were you all this time?" He sighed wearily and rubbed his nose. "It's complicated to explain. I've had a complex history too." Jack chuckled. "And yeah, I can't really compare my story to yours. If you don't mind, I'll start from the beginning as well." "Don't you need to go to work or something?" Allison asked. "No, I work from home." "Wow. I'll tell you about work later. So, let me begin. I grew up in a regular family, went to a regular school, and got into a regular university to become a lawyer. That's where I met Ella." "Ella, a lawyer?" Allison interjected. The idea of her mother-in-law in such a profession didn't quite match up in her mind. Jack chuckled. "Ella isn't just a lawyer. Although I met her in university, she wasn't actually a student there. She just came with her friends to some concert or something like that. That's how I met her." Jack suddenly fell silent, gazing off as if into the past. "Was she beautiful?" Allison asked. He smiled and nodded. Striking would be the right word. Tall, slim, redhead, fashionable, and most importantly, incredibly self-confident. "What about you at the time?" she asked. He shrugged. But I wouldn't say I was a nerd or unnoticed. Suddenly, he furrowed his brow, and his eyebrows came together at a very familiar angle. At that moment, Allison realized that Alex's eyebrows moved just the same way. That's why Jack's face seemed so familiar to her. I was a good student. I was tall and good-looking too. I played the guitar and was into football. For some reason, she noticed me. Did you fall in love with each other? I don't know if Ella is capable of love, but I definitely fell in love with her at first sight. Perhaps she felt the same about you. I'd like to believe that. However, when I thought about it years later, I concluded that for some unknown reason, Ella considered me a promising husband and a good catch. We started dating, and back then, I was ready to do anything for her. I had no idea what kind of person she was. Was she the same as she is now? Yes and no. Outwardly, she seemed cheerful, light-hearted, and confident. I didn't think too much about what she did. Where did she study or work? Allison was surprised by her sudden interest in her mother-in-law's life. For some reason, she hadn't thought of Ella as a young person herself before. It was unexpected to meet someone who knew her in her youth, and Allison was curious about how Ella had become the woman who was willing to sell her own grandchild. It's hard to say where she studied. She had a lot of skills and sometimes provided information from different fields of knowledge. But to be honest, I never found out if she actually graduated from anywhere. I tried to find out for a while, but she always skillfully avoided giving a straight answer. Did she have a job somewhere? Somewhere. Yes, she often had these things she called work, but I couldn't really figure out exactly what she did. But you won't believe it, I didn't find it suspicious. Were you in love? Yes, it blinds you. Did you get married? A few years later, after I graduated from university and got a good job. By the way, I didn't have my own place to live back then. My parents lived in a very small town, in a different city. Before the wedding, I was racking my brain about where Ella and I would live. And then, unexpectedly, she came up with a solution herself. She said she had an apartment inherited from her grandmother. You know that apartment well, the one Ella still lives in. That's right. What happened to you both after the wedding and the move? At first, nothing changed. I was enjoying married life, working, and Ella was doing something. She worked, or so it seemed. I was absolutely happy and didn't notice anything around me. And then Alex was born. Jack nodded. Did you love him? Very much, more than anything in the world. The day he was born became the happiest day of my life. However, it was precisely after Alex came into our family that I began to see through it all. What do you mean? I began to realize that my wife was not the person I thought she was all this time. It all started with me suddenly understanding that Ella was completely indifferent to our child. Of course, it was imperceptible at first. She smiled, took care of him, did all the things a mother should do. But I felt like her smile was insincere and that she resented the responsibilities of motherhood. I began to spend more time with our son. It's a shame he was too young to remember it well. He remembers you, Allison said, vaguely and not very clearly. But he does remember. Jack sighed. I tried to be a good father and husband, but after Ella's pregnancy and childbirth, it was as if she got tired of pretending, and I started noticing it, started asking questions first to myself and then to her. Did she answer you? He shook his head. No, she just acted surprised, saying I was scaring her, that she loved me and the child, that her work was too complicated for me to understand if she started talking about it. But I began noticing more and more strange things, like her coming and going at different times. That too. She often interacted with various mysterious people. Expensive things suddenly started appearing at our home, things that I definitely couldn't afford on my salary. Ella herself sometimes looked and dressed very lavishly. I didn't understand women's cosmetics, jewelry, shoes, but it was clear that these were far beyond our family budget. And she never told you what she was doing. Sometimes she said she helped foreigners organize city tours, sometimes that she was organizing events, and sometimes something else. She seemed less and less interested in spending time with our son. Did you find out what she was doing? I didn't have concrete evidence at the time, just suspicions. I think it involved various things, dealing in stolen goods, possibly distributing illegal substances, pimping, fraud, and a lot more. How horrifying. He nodded. At first, I felt the way you did these past months. I thought I was going crazy or just watching too many crime dramas. It was hard to believe that my wife, the mother of my child, was involved in something illegal. And in general, it was difficult to believe that she wasn't the person I thought she was. Alex mentioned that he remembers one night when there was a thunderstorm. He heard strange sounds and witnessed an argument. But he didn't understand and doesn't remember what happened then. Jack sighed and covered his face with his hands. He sat like that for a few seconds, then straightened up, removed his hands from his face, and looked directly into Allison's eyes. So my son remembers that night. What a nightmare. Will you tell me what happened that night? Of course, Ella came home late that night. We had a major argument, the most intense one in all the years we were together. I demanded answers. At first, she pretended not to understand anything. But apparently, at some point, she got tired of it. She shouted, "Stop bothering me with your questions. I'll do whatever I want. You've always been fine with it. So why are you suddenly meddling in my life?" Jack suddenly stood up and paced around the room, clearly agitated. I didn't expect what would happen next. What happened? In short, at some point, she pulled out a gun and fired it. What? Not at me, but somewhere out of an open window, I think. She said, "Now do you understand what I'm involved in? If I need to carry a weapon." I told her I was taking our son and leaving. Then she pointed the gun at me and said, "No, you're leaving alone." She was out of control, and I left. Because you were scared. That too. You never returned home after that. I filed for divorce. However, it turned out my wife wasn't carrying a gun in her purse for no reason. She had connections everywhere, including in the court. I faced a slew of strange accusations, being a bad father, jealous, prone to scandals, unfaithful, a drunkard, and so on. Jack sighed. I lost the case. But what's even worse, I lost the right to see my son. What did you do? What I still blame myself for. All these events overwhelmed me in an instant. I left my job, went back to my hometown, and started drinking. At first, I thought it was just acute stress. I was deeply affected by the divorce and losing my son. Then it stretched to a month, then another. Before I knew it, I went from being a successful lawyer to a pathetic alcoholic, scraping by with odd jobs. "I'm sorry," Allison said softly. "It's my own fault," Jack bitterly replied. Of course, in that state, there was no way to think about winning the court case or regaining the right to see my son. And I was too ashamed to face him. Ella probably said all sorts of things about me. "How did you manage all these years?" "Badly, mostly by drinking. For the first few years, I drank anything I could find every day, non-stop. My parents tried to reason with me, but I didn't listen back then. It was only when my mom and dad passed away one after the other that I started to come to my senses. I got a shift job and drank less. Of course, I didn't drink on the job, but when I came home, I'd start binging again. That went on for several years. The only thing was that during sober periods, I'd wonder how my son was doing, how he was growing up without me, what kind of person Ella was turning him into. I started reading various books." "Books?" Allison asked, surprised by the unexpected turn. "Yes, about psychology, about all sorts of maniacs, psychopaths, criminals, fraudsters." It was as if my eyes were gradually opening to how terrible a person my ex-wife was. I started getting myself together. "You don't drink anymore?" "Not a drop in 2 years. I realized that even though I lost so many years, I can still do something good. I remembered my hobby from when I was a teenager. I now earn a living making furniture, so I have orders, and I have money." "That's great." "It is. I can't complain. There's enough for a decent life, and I'm even saving for my old age." Once I started understanding where I was and what was happening, I thought I needed to decide how to move forward. And now I don't drink, I have work, and I have enough to live on. I became curious about how my son was doing. "Did you move to this house to keep an eye on him?" I wanted to be closer, but honestly, I never got close to him. I was afraid he would ask, "Where were you all these years, Dad?" "Wow, you were so close for all that time, and Alex didn't even know." Jack nodded. "Unfortunately, I began to take an interest in my ex-wife, and you could say I've been gathering information about her all this time. I learned many interesting things." "So, did you know who I was from the beginning?" Allison shouted. Did you know that my child is your grandson? Forgive me, my dear, Jack pleaded. You came in the middle of the night, somehow found me. It's just fate. You were so frightened. I was afraid it would drive you insane. It's driving me insane right now, Allison admitted. Jack nodded. I won't hide it. It's maddening for me too. There are so many coincidences in the story. The most important thing is that you're safe now. What's your plan moving forward? I'll need more time to gather evidence, and in the meantime, you can stay here. I understand you don't have anywhere else to go. So, a strange period began in Allison's life, a time of waiting. On one hand, she realized she was in an unfamiliar situation, waiting for Jack to find evidence of guilt or something else involving Ella. She was also waiting for the birth of her child. Additionally, she was hiding from Ella and presumably the people she worked with. However, it was in this strange setting that Allison felt the most calm and comfortable. The house was surrounded by a tall, old brick fence, about 2.5 meters high. Although the plot of land was small, it was densely populated with trees, which concealed the area behind the house from prying eyes and gave it an air of secrecy and seclusion. In short, Allison felt completely safe. It was strange to think that Ella was, in essence, not far away from her, but at the same time, Allison was not in danger. Her mother-in-law would never suspect that she should look for her right here. Jack showed her the house and didn't demand her help, but Allison still tried to do everything she could. Cooking, washing dishes, cleaning. Allison, please stop, Jack would tell her every time. Don't worry, I haven't given birth yet. Allison would reply with a laugh, I feel fine, and I can't just lie in bed all day. Jack nodded thoughtfully and remained silent. However, the next day, after breakfast, he said to her, put the dishes aside, let's go to the garden. There, he led her between a few trees and pointed with his hand. Here, Allison saw a whole garden corner, a hammock hanging between the trees, a cozy lounge chair, and a small wooden table. Did you do all of this for me? Jack shrugged. The weather is nice. You need to spend more time outdoors. Thank you so much. No, thank you, Allison. Me, for what? Your arrival became the missing piece I needed to fully wake up. That's not true. You had a plan. That's the point. A plan, Allison, is useless without specific actions. Your presence is what motivated me to act. Wow. I hope this will all be over soon. I'm worried about giving birth. I think if Ella wants, she can track me down at the hospital. She knows that I'll need to give birth soon and that I'll show up at some maternity hospital in the city. I'm afraid she has the means to trace it. Jack frowned. I've been thinking about this in recent days too. I'll solve this issue. Don't worry. Thank you for everything, Jack. You're the one I should thank. For some reason, Allison had started to think about Alex more often lately, and she and Jack had talked a lot about him. I keep thinking about what a mistake I made leaving my son with that woman, Jack confessed at one point. What has he become with her? I didn't quite get this, Allison replied. Although he's my husband and the father of my child, I guess it's uncomfortable to realize that. Yes, you're right. Sometimes it terrifies me to think about it. I hope both of us will have a chance to get to know him better. I wonder, Allison said, how much does he know about what his mother is doing? Did he know what would happen to me and our child? Jack sighed. To my immense regret, I suppose so. At least in broad strokes. My poor boy. What has he become because of me? Don't blame yourself. It's the past. You can't bring it back. You're right about that. We'll do everything to make the future beautiful. I want my child to grow up in love and happiness, but I don't know if I can provide that. You can, I'm sure of it. You have everything you need inside you, and I, as a grandfather, will do everything in my power. I suddenly realized that I never really thought about the future. There was Ella telling me what to do, and I was like in a dream. But now I understand that I have to plan my own future and the future of my child. What exactly do you want to do now? I need to think about how and where I can earn money, and where to live. You can live here for as long as you want. Thank you. You've been very kind to me. Don't mention it. You and your child are the closest people to me. Well, my son, of course. Always remember that, Allison. Okay. I think I'll have to get back to school as soon as possible and then look for a job. But I'm also trying to imagine what will happen when Alex returns from the army. Will you be together? Allison shrugged. It seems that nothing connects us except a child. And I'm sure Alex didn't expect me to be in this house when he returns. Allison pondered. Maybe he didn't plan on coming back at all. I think he was happy to escape from his mother. Do you think I won't see him again? We can try to get in touch with him while he's in the army. That's a good idea. A's for housing and work. Don't worry for now. You can stay with me as long as you need. I'll help as much as I can and try to provide for you. Exactly 2 weeks later, Allison woke up in the middle of the night with severe pains in her lower abdomen. Lately, she had been feeling them periodically and had almost gotten used to them. However, now she understood that it had all truly begun. "Jack!" she shouted as loudly as she could. "Jack!" A few seconds later, he appeared in the room. "What's happening, Allison?" "My water broke." "I see." He helped her get dressed, and they went downstairs. There, Jack seated Allison on the couch and hurried back upstairs to grab a bag. "Wait for me. I'll be back soon." He left, and Allison couldn't help but think about how accustomed she had become to Jack and how much calmer she felt in his presence. Fortunately, he returned in just a few minutes. "Let's go," he said. "Where?" Allison asked. "To the hospital. Where else?" "But Ella." "Don't worry. I've taken care of everything." They left the house and got into the car. Jack entered an address into the GPS, and Allison realized it was on the other side of town. Luckily, it was night time, and they drove quickly without encountering traffic. "Am I going to give birth at someone's house?" Allison asked timidly. Jack widened his eyes. "We're going to a hospital where there's a doctor I helped significantly in the past. Everything will go smoothly and quietly. No one will find out about you." "Well," he chuckled, and Allison couldn't help but smile. When they arrived at the hospital, they were immediately greeted. Allison was taken to an examination room, and after a minute, a tall, bearded doctor entered. "Planning to have a baby?" he asked cheerfully. "I don't know," Allison replied, frightened. It seemed he understood her state because he softened his tone. "We'll figure it out now," he said in a calm voice and winked. Allison liked Dr. Sam. He quickly and gently examined her and confirmed that her contractions were good, and they had arrived at the hospital in time. Allison was taken to a small private room, and after some time, they let Jack in. He had been there by her side all these hours, holding her hand, bringing her drinks, and distracting her with conversation. "Well, it's time to move to the delivery room," Sam said after another examination. Allison looked at him fearfully. "Contractions eventually end, and it's preferable to have a natural delivery. Can Jack be with me?" she asked. Allison pleaded with the doctor, and then gave Jack the same pleading look. "Well, I didn't need men fainting on me in there. I won't faint." "Oh, all right, go ahead. I'll let the nurses know. They'll get you changed." For Allison, the childbirth became one long, drawn-out nightmare. Despite everything going well, and the doctors praising her for breathing correctly and following all their instructions, it was still a harrowing experience. Jack was there by her side. "Congratulations," the doctor said. "You have a baby boy." The next morning, Allison opened her eyes. The first thing she saw was the crib, and then Jack, asleep in a chair next to her. She moved carefully, feeling the pain throughout her body. Even with these gentle movements, Jack instantly woke up and opened his eyes. "Already awake?" he asked. "Yes." "How are you feeling?" "Hard to say. Everything hurts. But I'm very glad it didn't turn out too bad. I think I don't remember half of yesterday." He chuckled. "By the way, neither do I. Phew. I've never been so worried." "Worried about what?" "About you. About the baby." "The baby?" Allison tried to get up and winced from the pain. Jack jumped up. "Lie down. Where are you going?" "The baby is still sleeping." "I want to see him," Allison replied. "All right, let me help then." Jack reached out, and with his support, Allison managed to get on her feet and take a few steps to the crib. Their son was sleeping peacefully. He was small, pink, and wrinkled. "He's so tiny." "Very. And it's hard to tell who he looks like." "I think all newborns look the same." "I agree. Have you thought of a name yet?" Allison smiled gently. "Maybe in honor of his grandpa, Jack." Jack looked embarrassed. "Oh, come on. I'm serious." "So am I. I'm definitely not a role model. But if you allow me, I'd suggest the name Leo. That was my father's name, and he was definitely a good manual." "Leo." Allison said slowly, as if trying to name on for size. I really like it. I'm glad, but I'm not insisting. It really sounds beautiful. Allison spent 2 more days in the hospital. The birth had gone well, and the baby was completely healthy. She learned how to breastfeed, how to feed, bathe, and change him. After that, leaving the hospital made Allison feel more at ease. I've got all the instructions written down. The number of the best newborners is in my pocket. We can go home without worries, Jack cheerfully told the young mother. Wow, was the first thing Allison said after stepping through the front door. The house was absolutely clean, bright, and beautiful. A nursery had been set up on the ground floor. I thought it would be more convenient for you downstairs, so I moved upstairs. The former living room now had a bed, a crib, a chair, a table, chairs, and a bookshelf. Everything was done in one style. How beautiful. Thank you, Jack. You're welcome, Allison. Their life went well from there. Allison learned to be a mother, and Jack helped her. He managed to work, study Ella's past and present, and help with the baby. Allison realized that she felt absolutely happy, peaceful, and safe. One day, as she sat playing with the baby, Jack burst in. She could tell from his face that something had happened. It's done, he said. Everything worked out. What worked out? I've gathered the necessary evidence of Ella's guilt, and I just took it to the police. Well, yes, they promised to thoroughly investigate everything, but there's enough evidence to put her away for a long time. You might need to give a statement. All right. The events unfolded rapidly from there. Ella was arrested, and Allison was called in to give her testimony. She honestly recounted the entire story, including her suspicions, her mother-in-law's strange behavior, and she even repeated the conversation she had overheard on the night she fled the house. Alex also gave his statement, although Allison didn't meet with him, so she didn't know what he had said. Nevertheless, a trial took place, and Ella received a lengthy prison sentence. It turned out that Ella had been involved in illegal activities for many years, confirming all of Jack's suspicions. Her criminal activities included trafficking stolen goods, various forms of fraud targeting wealthy tourists, document forgery, drug distribution, counterfeit medications, and running a brothel. After the trial, Allison and Jack went to meet with Alex. Father and son finally saw each other again, but it wouldn't be accurate to say the meeting went well. Hello, son, Jack said. Alex nodded. Hello, how are you? Fine, and a bit shocked that you're alive and exist. Forgive me. You're nobody to me, and there's nothing to forgive. I'm sorry, son. We need to talk about this. Not now. Allison decided to intervene in the conversation. Do you want to see your son? Alex shrugged. Show him. Allison cautiously handed over the bundle with the baby. Alex didn't take him into his arms, just looked at him. He's so small, he said. His name is Leo, like my grandpa. Allison nodded. It was Jack's suggestion. Grandpa Leo was a good manual, I like it. That's how their meeting ended. They agreed to stay in touch, but Alex didn't show any particular joy or enthusiasm in his eyes when looking at Allison. You can live in our house, he said to his wife as they parted ways. Mother and I will need it for a long time. Do you think he'll forgive me? Jack asked Allison as they were heading back. She shrugged. At least now you have a chance. This time, I'll do my best not to miss it. After returning from seeing Alex, Allison realized that she could and should move back to the house where she used to live. Firstly, Alex had allowed her to do so. Secondly, it made sense as she was still his wife. Thirdly, Ella was no longer there. However, she had many reasons not to want to move. She didn't want to return to the space associated with so many terrifying memories. She didn't want to leave the cozy home she had found in her dreams. Most importantly, she couldn't imagine being alone. Well, not entirely alone, as she had Leo, but she didn't want to be without Jack's support. Over time, she had grown so accustomed to him. When Allison thought about this, she scolded herself. What was she even thinking? She had a husband who would return from the army in a few months, and now, with Ella no longer in their way, they needed to try to build their relationship, at least for Leo's sake. It seemed that Jack also didn't want Allison and Leo to move. He tried to persuade her to stay. Why do you need to move? He asked. We can't live with you, Allison replied. Why not? Are you unhappy here? Of course not. Then stay. Jack, I can't. I need to learn to live independently. Alex will be back from the army soon, and we need to build our own life. Learn to be together for Leo's sake. I've already grown too dependent on you, relying on your support. Isn't that a bad thing? I value you and your company greatly, but it can't be like this forever. I wouldn't mind, he said softly, but it's your decision. In any case, I'll always be nearby and will come at your first call. Of course, Allison moved. Of course, she brought her son with her. A lump formed in her throat as she stepped over the threshold of the familiar house. Without Ella, it was quiet here. However, everything remained in its place. Her belongings, the furniture. It seemed as though the stern landlady had stepped out for just a moment and would soon return. Well, here we are, home, Allison said to her son. But Allison didn't feel at home. She had to calm down, muster her strength, and start anew. She tidied up the apartment, transformed the room where she and Alex used to live into a room for her and Leo. Of course, Jack didn't abandon her. He helped with the move. He often visited her, assisting with her son in the house. How are you managing here? He would ask her. Allison would shrug. Fine. Getting used to it. He surveyed the apartment. Of course, I don't remember what it was like here more than 10 years ago, and I still see traces of Ella. But it seems to be getting better. Thank you, I'm trying. Allison was trying hard not only in this regard. She also actively started working in other directions. She attended a school and arranged with the dean to resume her studies in a few months. And of course, she began to rebuild her relationship with Alex. She started writing to him frequently, sending photos of their son, and putting together packages of goodies. At first, he rarely replied to her, and when he did, it was short and dry. However, over time, his letters became longer and more frequent. Eventually, he even found a way to use the phone. They started calling each other, exchanging photos, and their correspondence became more personal. Allison also tried to gently reconnect him with his father, and little by little, it seemed to be working. They talked on the phone a couple of times when Jack came to spend time with his grandson. Finally, the day came when Alex was supposed to return from the army. Allison was very nervous from the early morning. Once again, for the umpteenth time, they would try to mend their little, strange family. Alex, she shouted when she saw him getting off the train. She couldn't run towards him as she was carrying Leo. Alex approached them on his own. He had changed over the past year. You could see it in the photos he had sent, but it was even more noticeable in person. He had grown more mature, and his gaze seemed more responsible and adult. Hello, he said to his wife, planting a cautious kiss on her cheek. Then he looked at his son. Leo, with a serious expression, gazed at his father. Hello, son, Jack said at that moment. Hello, father, Alex replied without taking his eyes off Leo. Let's go. We shouldn't linger, Allison urged the men. They arrived home. The house has become much cozier, Alex said. I had to rearrange it for Leo, Allison explained somewhat apologetically. But I tried not to throw anything away. I kept everything in Ella's room. Alex nodded. No, everything's fine. You did everything right. I really like it. Finally, it looks like a normal human dwelling. Allison watched her husband. He seemed unable to believe he was home. He contemplated the walls and furniture thoughtfully. It didn't seem like he was just surprised by the rearrangements. Allison thought she had been right, and Alex indeed had no intention of returning here. Let's go to the table, Jack suggested. He was nervous too. His voice trembled slightly. It wasn't noticeable from the outside, but over all this time, Allison had learned to discern the nuances in his voice. She gave him an approving smile quietly, out of Alex's sight. How was your journey? Allison asked, breaking the silence. Fine, Alex replied. I still can't believe I'm here. I can't believe I'm seeing you either, Jack added. Alex looked at him and then quickly averted his gaze. I'm sorry, Dad. I just can't get used to the fact that you're here. So, I can't immediately express my heartfelt feelings as a son. I understand completely. It's all my fault, Jack responded. Alex, Allison called. Would you like to hold Leo? Sure. Alex very timidly and cautiously picked up his son. Following Allison's instructions, Leo once again looked attentively and curiously at his father but remained silent. He was a very well-behaved child, rarely throwing tantrums without reason, and had grown very attached to Jack. However, even though he gazed at his father with curiosity and caution, he didn't cry. "Strange," Alex said. "It's too early to tell, but I think he'll resemble Grandpa Leo somehow. I just can't figure out what exactly." Jack smiled, the dimple on his chin. "Neither you nor I have it, but your grandfather did, exactly there." Allison quietly admired 3 generations of men and felt absolutely happy. She thought there was hope that things would finally work out for them. The first few days after Alex's return felt like he was settling back into reality. He slept a lot, and even when he woke up, he lay in bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling or out the window. He didn't go anywhere, only responding to Allison's invitations for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. He also didn't show much interest in his son. Sometimes he looked at him with surprise, as if not believing that he actually existed. After a few days, Allison decided to talk to him. "Maybe we should talk about everything," she said over breakfast. To Alex's surprise, he nodded quickly. "Perhaps we should," he replied. "I've been thinking about everything for a long time, but I can't seem to make any decisions. Maybe you can help me with that." "I think we can help each other," Allison replied. Alex looked at her attentively. "You've changed a lot. You've become smarter, more mature, more determined." "I have to." "You seem to have changed too. I hope for the better. I guess it's hard for me to judge, as I barely knew you." He sighed and looked away. "Just as I didn't really know you." Allison took a deep breath and asked the question that had been haunting her for months. "Did you deliberately get involved with me?" Alex raised his eyebrows in surprise. "What are you talking about? Was it planned? Was it Ella's plan?" "Well, the child." "No." Alex even flinched. "No, Allison, I would never." She breathed a sigh of relief. "Yes, I'm a terrible person," Alex continued. "I'm not worthy of you and our son. I know that." "Alex, why are you saying this?" He shook his head vehemently. "Please don't interrupt. I know it's true." "Alex, I understand that Ella wasn't the best person." He smirked. "If only it were just Ella. Tell me everything from the very beginning." Nervously, he paced around the room. "Well, I knew that someday this day would come. In fact, I began to suspect that my mother wasn't the most law-abiding woman when I was a teenager. Before that, I just understood that she didn't really love me and had a strange job. But around the age of 14, I put all the available information together and realized that something was very suspicious. I started to remember how our house would often have expensive things, like electronics, fur coats, jewelry, and so on. Then these things would disappear. That my mom worked for who knows who on an unclear schedule. That strange people would call her at all hours of the day and night. And that strange people would periodically come to our house." "Did you talk to her about it?" Alex shook his head. "At some point, we silently reached a strange agreement between us. She never told me what she did, and I never asked. But you knew." "I suspected. But what could I do? She's my mother." "Did you love her?" He shrugged. "Maybe. She's my mother after all." "And did she love you?" "Doubtful. I don't think she ever loved anyone besides herself." "I'm so sorry." "It's okay. I mean it. I believe you, Allison, but my mother didn't. Anyway, that's how we lived. She didn't bother me, and I didn't bother her. You know what I used to dream about? Running away from home." He looked at her with a surprised expression. "How did you guess?" "It wasn't that hard. You always had a look like you wanted to get as far away from here as possible." Alex chuckled. "I didn't know it was so noticeable, even though you're quite observant." Allison smiled at this point. "Yes, so observant that I didn't understand Ella's plan until almost the very end." "Don't blame yourself for that, blame me. After all, I had my suspicions. Let's continue in order." "All right. So, I really wanted to escape from here. It started to get a bit easier when I finished high school and got into college. I thought that after a couple of years of studying, I'd find a job, rent an apartment, and move away from my mother forever. And then appeared. Yes. Everything escalated very quickly." "Agreed. You were my first girlfriend, you know." Allison blushed. "I love you too." Alex nodded. "But, by mistake, everything happened, I mean Leo." "Alex, please don't say it like that." "I have to, Allison. My mother always had some sort of mystical influence over me. Not just you." He chuckled. that's for sure. Anyway, I went to her because I had nowhere else to turn. If I had a father, any father, even an alcoholic one, even one who didn't live with us, I would have turned to him. But there was no father. And Ella had her plan for me. Honestly, I don't know. It seems to me she didn't come up with it right away. On the first evening when I told her all of this, she yelled at me like crazy. Called me a fool, a loser, and many other things. I was prepared to have to convince you to have an abortion. At this point, he flinched and looked at Leo. The child was sitting on the floor, playing with a cube. As if sensing his father's gaze, he looked up, gazing attentively at his father with his big blue eyes, and smiled for the first time in his life. Alex sighed, and in the morning at breakfast, she changed completely, said that I had to marry you. I nearly choked. How did she explain that? She just said it was my responsibility. Suddenly, she started talking about family honor and all that. Mother knows how to be convincing when she wants to. But then everything started. Allison nodded. The wedding, well, it was hardly a wedding at first. By the way, I had no suspicions at the beginning. Me neither. She just acted like she didn't love me. He nodded. I even thought she made us get married out of spite, but number and you became an additional target for her torment. When did you start to realize that something was wrong? When she suddenly took an interest in the child. Started going with me to the clinics and all. Yep, she never went anywhere with me. I can't even remember her being concerned about my health. And suddenly she had this newfound love for her grandson. I understood that she was planning something, but I didn't know what. And then the sudden opportunity to join the army, and I took it as a sign. Allison nodded. I remember, you looked happy, and I was. I guess you figured out that I didn't plan on going back home. Yes, our sudden love faded, and you didn't want the child, and neither did I. I'm sorry, but yeah, I understand. Thank you for being honest, at least now. Should have done it sooner. You started paying attention to me out of the blue, trying to get closer, which confused me and made me feel even more like a scoundrel. I was in a hurry to get away as quickly as possible, so I wouldn't get attached to you, let alone the child. At the train station, were you trying to warn me? Something like that. It was a pitiful deal with my conscience. It was all I could do at that moment. In the army, on one hand, I felt relieved. I had gotten rid of the three of you. But on the other hand, I dreaded what Ella might have in store for you and the child. I knew I would never come back to you. Were you upset when you found out about Ella? I felt a tremendous sense of relief and, yes, a bit upset. Whoever she might be, she's my mother. But of course, I'm glad that you and Leo are okay. What about your father? My father. Will you communicate with him? Alex shrugged. It's complicated. After all, he abandoned me. No, I understand my mother can make anyone do anything, but I can't help but think about how my life would have turned out if it hadn't been Ella who raised me. He looked at Allison with anguish. I'm not a healthy person. I'm terrible. That's not true. It is. Allison got goosebumps from his words. She realized that she had never seriously thought about what would have happened to her and Leo if she hadn't run away from home that night. In this light, Alex, who suspected everything, did indeed seem to her not the best husband and father. But you didn't know. I suspected. That was enough. Alex, I hope someday you can forgive me. I forgive you. Don't rush. We have other topics to discuss. What's next for us and our family? Alex sighed. I can't promise anything right now. I'm still figuring out what's happening with me and what I want. I suggest we just live for now and try, at least for the sake of our son, for Leo. They both turned simultaneously to look at their peacefully playing child. From that moment on, they began to try to build a family, to strive for a better life. Both Allison and Alex put in a lot of effort. Alex found a job. Won't you continue your education? Allison asked him. Her husband shook his head. Maybe later. In a couple of years. Right now, I need to work. He got a job as a laborer at a construction company. He quickly adapted and started bringing in money for the household. Allison was very pleased with this because living off Jack was uncomfortable. She did receive some child support, but it wasn't enough. Yet, Jack still insisted on helping. We can't take money from you anymore, Allison told him. Why? Because we're adults and should learn to provide for ourselves, especially for our child. Jack didn't give up easily. When Allison finally won, he resorted to cunning. He brought bags of groceries, toys, and children's clothing. When Allison protested, he shrugged and put on an innocent look. I'm not bringing this for you, it's for Leo. I'm a grandfather, and I have the right to spoil my grandson. Allison couldn't argue with that. Moreover, she didn't mind Jack's visits. With each passing day, he felt closer and dearer to her. They could talk for hours on any topic. Leo had also grown attached to him. However, Alex's relationship with his father was still strained. It was clear that he was making an effort, but forgiving his father wasn't easy for him. I'm very worried about this, Jack admitted to Allison one day. She nodded. Me too. I think Alex doesn't hold any grudges against you. He just doesn't understand why he needs me now. He went through all the difficulties on his own. Everything he should have learned from his father, he learned on his own. The past can't be changed. Now you can only try to rebuild your relationship. But I must say, you're a great grandfather. Jack smiled. That's reassuring. By the way, Jack suddenly said thoughtfully, have you ever wanted to find out anything about your own family? Allison shrugged. Well, I hardly remember anything. They certainly didn't tell me anything about them in the orphanage. Although, sometimes I wonder who they are and why they abandoned me. So, what? Would you like to see them? I don't know. It's scary to imagine who they could turn out to be. Drug addicts, alcoholics, maybe just ordinary people who didn't want their own child. And now they're living happily, not thinking about me. Jack approached Allison and gently put his arm around her shoulder. I'm sorry, he suddenly said. Maybe I shouldn't have started this conversation. No, you should have. I've been thinking about it for a long time, and maybe it's time to finally find out and resolve this. I don't necessarily have to build a relationship with them or even be friends. It's enough just to know. All right, then I promise you we'll look into it. Thank you. I'd do anything for you. Having said that, Jack seemed somewhat embarrassed. He removed his hand from Allison's shoulder and stepped back, pretending to watch Leo. Allison was also taken aback. What did that even mean? Just a caring father-in-law's remark, or something more? Fortunately, at that moment, Alex returned from work, and this awkward moment dissipated on its own. After the conversation with Jack, Allison began to contemplate. She was genuinely curious about finding out who her parents were. Were they alive? Did she have siblings, grandparents? She decided it was time to visit the orphanage where she had grown up. She chose the right time, left her son with Jack, and went. Do you want me to come with you? Jack offered. No need. I'd like to handle this on my own. All right, as you wish. Good day, greeted her the caregiver who was watching over the children in the playground. Are you looking for someone? She was a young woman whom Allison didn't know. The girl appeared pleasant and friendly. I grew up here, Allison replied. Oh, was all the caregiver could say. I wanted to find out about my parents. Is Maria here? I'm not sure, but probably yes. Would you like me to escort you? No, thank you. I know where to go. All right. How long have you been working here? 6 months. Why? Just curious. And how do you like it? The young woman shrugged. It varies. The kids are different, but it's challenging to form attachments with them. Allison nodded and remembered her own caregivers. With time, it gets easier for everyone. But don't forget, they become very attached to you too. The young woman gave Allison a strange look, nodded uncertainly, and turned away. Allison proceeded into the building. The director was in her office. Good day, Maria, greeted Allison. Oh, replied the director. What a surprise. Come in, have a seat. Do you remember me? Allison, of course I remember. I've been working here for 30 years, and I remember all of you. Tell me, how have you been? I've been well, thank you. I enrolled in college, got married, and had a child. I'm currently on maternity leave, but I plan to return to my studies in a few months. That's wonderful. So much has happened in your life. You're so young, yet you're already married and a mother. Who will take care of your child when you return to school? At first, my father-in-law, and then we'll send him to daycare. That's great. I'm very happy for you. It's nice to have such a close-knit family. That's what we wish for all of you. Thank you. Are you happy? Maria unexpectedly asked. It varies, but yes, I'm happy. Every day. Not consistently, but yes. There are moments of happiness every day. You can't come up with a better answer than that. Thank you. And how are you doing? Well, nothing really changes here, Allison. We're still working. Kids come, they grow up, leave, and new ones arrive. But I assume you didn't just come to visit me, Maria said. Allison nodded and replied, I wanted to find out about my parents. Maria frowned and asked, Are you sure? Yes, Allison affirmed. You do realize they could be anyone, right? Do you know who they are? She shook her head. I remember you, but when it comes to your parents, I'm afraid my memory fails me. Your information has already been archived. So, there's nothing that can be done. Why not? I'll write a request now, send it off. They'll send the documents, and you'll find out everything. Thank you. Don't thank me too soon. It's not a quick process, and it might take a while. But I promise I'll make every effort to gather all the information I can about your relatives. I'm not in a hurry, but I think I should try, if only for the sake of my son. That's the right decision. No matter who they turn out to be, it will relieve you of the most significant nightmare, the unknown. Half an hour later, Allison left her former orphanage and realized that she had made the right choice. She felt a sudden lightness in her heart. At home, there were news waiting for her. It was clear that something significant was happening as soon as Allison crossed the threshold. It was unusually loud. Alex and Jack were talking. They weren't exactly arguing, but the conversation was emotional. Son, think about it, Jack said. You can't leave your wife and child for so long. Really? Alex responded. Well, you didn't think about me like that. You're not me. You're better. I'm not sure. But I am. How would you know, Dad? You don't even know me. I see that you care about your wife and child. Exactly. And what I want to do is the best option. What's going on? Allison asked. The men fell silent as if on cue and turned to look at her. I'm going to leave, Alex finally said. Allison froze. What do you mean? Leave? Where? For work, to the Far East. Can we go with you? Are we moving? No, I'm going alone. This job doesn't allow for family nearby. There won't be a place for you there. I see. How long are you going for? 6 months. If it works out, they might extend it. 6 months. Allison had been prepared to hear a month or so. That's too long, was all she managed to say. Alex nodded. I've been trying to tell him, he said helplessly, looking at Jack. Her husband clenched his jaw and gazed at Allison. They're offering good money for this. Alex, we can handle it, Allison began. You don't have to. He shook his head. It's not just that, Dad. He looked at Jack, who flinched because it was the first time his son had addressed him that way. Please, take Leo for a walk, he said. Understood, Jack replied, quickly gathering his grandson, taking the stroller, and leaving. Allison froze, realizing that Alex wanted to talk about something personal. I don't know how to start, he finally said. Just say it. For instance, that you don't have any feelings for me. He sighed. I'm sorry. That's not something you should apologize for. I know. I should be apologizing for many other things. If it weren't for me, your life would have turned out completely different. If it weren't for you, Leo wouldn't be in my life. And I can't imagine it without him now. I'm glad at least you don't hate me for that. I don't hate you at all. You're a very good person, Allison. Alex, you're not a bad person either. Seeing him about to interrupt, Allison desperately waved her hands. Please, don't interrupt. Yes, I know you blame yourself for many things, and indeed, some of your actions are hard to call good. However, please see that there is much good in you too. You have a conscience. You testified against Ella, even though I know how hard it was for you. You came back to us from the army, even though you hadn't planned on it. You care for me and our child. Could I have acted differently? You could, and many would have. But you, a good person, didn't. I'm very grateful and glad that you see the good in me, Allison. However, there's also darkness in me that I can't overcome. No matter how hard I try or how much I break myself, being at home with you is unbearable. She nodded. I can see it in your eyes. I need to escape. From this house, from this city, from my father, from you, from our son. I need to be alone with myself, to understand what kind of person I am. I understand. He cautiously took her hand. I'm sorry, but it seems I don't love you. Allison smiled. I realized that a long time ago. However, I understand something else. You don't love me either. I thought we should save our marriage for Leo's sake. I thought so too, and honestly tried to do that. And it's definitely not because of you. You're an amazing girl. And, as it turns out, an excellent wife and mother. Thank you. You should thank yourself. But I think we'll both be better off apart. Of course, I'll help you and our son. Don't worry about that. This house, of course, will remain with you. We'll keep in touch periodically. I want to see him grow up. I want to know that you're okay. Of course, I want to visit you during vacations. But right now, I need a different place and time. I understand you, and thank you for finding the strength to talk about this. Don't worry about us. We'll manage soon. Leo can go to daycare, I'll go back to school, and then to work. And I'm not worried. Alex suddenly smiled. I know you won't be alone. Your father will always help you. He loves you and, of course, Leo. From the way it was said, for some reason, Allison suddenly blushed. Yes, she mumbled. Jack has grown very attached to Leo. And to you. Think about it. Okay, it seems we've sorted everything out. My train is tomorrow. I'll go start packing and see what else I need to buy. He went into the room, and Allison cautiously sat down on a chair. Her head was spinning. It seemed like she should be upset. Her husband was leaving, and he even said he didn't love her. But she had a strong sense of calm and that everything was going as it should have. It had long been clear that she and Alex didn't love each other, but they had both tried to save their marriage until the very end. How much they both had grown since their first meeting. Children to 18-year-old teenagers who knew nothing about themselves or their feelings. How much they both had to go through to mature. A few minutes later, Alex came out of the room. I'm going shopping, he said casually. I'll get some things for the road. Do you need anything for the house? Allison nodded. We're running out of milk and diapers. All right. He left. Half an hour later, Jack and Leo returned from their walk. Jack looked concerned and scrutinized Allison's face attentively, but remained silent, apparently deciding that if she wanted to, she would tell him what had happened. Everything's fine, Allison said. We talked. Did you convince him to stay? No. He's leaving tomorrow. What's good about that then? She smiled. We talked. We honestly admitted that we don't love each other. Alex is going to the Far East, and Leo and I are going to live in this apartment. He'll help us and stay in touch with me and the child. Jack listened attentively. So you don't love him? Yes, I realized that a long time ago. But I thought, then why all this? I wanted to save the family for the sake of our son. But fortunately, your son has also grown up and helped both of us make a difficult but right choice. How do you feel now? Completely calm and happy. Well then, I'm calm and happy too. And of course, you can always count on my help and support. If you want, you can move to my house. Your and Leo's room is still the same. And, if Alex agrees, we can rent out this house. Allison pondered. It was an enticing prospect. They would always need money, and she would feel safer with Jack. Is it just about convenience, or are there other reasons she wants to be with Jack? Allison tried to push these thoughts away. That evening, she discussed the idea of renting out the house with her husband. He was absolutely fine with it. Even though Ella doesn't live here, of course, neither you nor I have good memories of this awful place. And I don't particularly want my son to grow up in such a space. And the money won't hurt. And my father will be thrilled when you move in with him. Allison suddenly realized that she hadn't thought about Jack's comfort at all. Yes, of course, he said he was happy with them and that they could stay forever. But he was still a young man, attractive, intelligent, and earned decently. Perhaps over time, he would start dating someone, and then what? And if he later brought his girlfriend into the house? These thoughts made Allison uncomfortable. Despite her doubts, shortly after Alex's departure, Allison and her son moved in with Jack. Truth be told, she felt joy and relief for the second time. This time, it was under normal circumstances. Not hurriedly leaving this house in the middle of the night while pregnant. By the way, they managed to rent out the house quickly, already the next week. Of course, they had prepared the house together with Jack beforehand. Ella's things were moved to storage. At some point, Allison just wanted to throw everything away, but her conscience didn't allow it. Alex's belongings were sent to him by mail. It's strange to think that strangers will live here, Allison said when she and Jack finished the last preparations. I feel the same way. I hope they will be happy here. Allison nodded. I hope they'll completely change everything here. Jack raised an eyebrow in surprise, and Allison continued, or renovate and replace all the furniture. In short, I want nothing to remind us of Ella ever again. But you won't be living here anyway, Jack said confidently. Returning to their old house with the black roof, which looked gloomy on the outside but was warm and cozy inside, was pleasant. It feels like coming home, Allison told Jack. I'm glad. Leo seems to like it here more too. Yes, I noticed that he's more active here and hardly throws tantrums, and I also felt how much better it became when you two returned. The house seemed to come alive. It used to be so empty and cold. Thank you for everything you do for us. Allison, his voice trembled slightly. I've already said that I'm ready to do anything for you and Leo. He went out into the yard. At such moments, Allison was at a loss and didn't know how to respond. On one hand, she enjoyed hearing this. She felt good and comfortable with Jack. But on the other hand, she felt like she was doing something wrong, encroaching on something she didn't have the right to. Time passed. Allison resumed her studies at the university, and Leo was old enough to attend daycare. Allison started actively attending classes and received praise for her efforts. She thought that if everything continued to go well, she would consider taking on some part-time work, taking orders for in-home services. They also occasionally had phone calls with Alex. The move and work seemed to be beneficial for him. From the videos and photos, it was clear that he had become tanned, matured, and looked content. He liked it on the Far East. The climate suited him, and although the work was challenging, it was interesting. The people around him were friendly. He would ask about his son and how Allison was doing. During one of their conversations, he cautiously said, I think you won't be angry if I allow myself to be frank. Of course not. What's the matter? I met a girl. I really like her, and it seems she likes me too. Well, that's wonderful. I'm very happy for you. Thank you. Of course, we don't know each other well yet, and it's too early to talk about anything, but I'm serious about her. I'm happy for you, Alex. Are you okay if we go ahead with the divorce? Okay. Allison suddenly realized that she had completely stopped attaching importance to the fact that she and Alex were still married. Nair, sure. Do you need to come for it? She asked. No, it's not necessary. You'll receive all the papers, and you'll just need to sign. He replied. Okay. So, you're not upset? He inquired. Of course not. I'm really happy that you're happy. Alex's relationship with his father seemed to be improving as well. Allison sometimes overheard Jack talking to his son on the phone. Usually, it was practical advice about household matters or fixing something. But it was clear that it was more than just that for Alex. By the way, Jack asked her during lunch, I keep forgetting to ask. What happened with the search for your birth parents? What? Allison didn't understand. Well, when you went to the orphanage. It was then that she remembered the envelope she had received a long time ago but had somehow misplaced during the chaos of moving from Ella's house to Jack's. I haven't opened it yet. She rushed to her room, and Jack followed. Puzzled. How could I forget about it? Allison lamented as she rummaged through her things. Don't worry, we'll find it, Jack reassured her. They found the envelope. Allison opened it with trembling hands. Inside were several copies of documents and a letter from Maria. Actually, everything could be understood from the letter. It turned out that Allison's birth parents were ordinary people. Her mother was a biology teacher, and her father worked as a lawyer in a small firm. She had no brothers or sisters. She was their only child. One winter evening, her parents were driving home from work and planned to pick up little Allison from daycare. However, on the way to their car, a drunk driver crashed into them, and her mother and father died on the spot. Allison cried when she read this. She had probably mentally prepared herself for the worst, thinking that her parents might have been drug addicts or alcoholics who had abandoned her. Back then, she would have just been relieved not to have known them. But learning that they loved their daughter, if not for the tragic accident, would still be with her, was painful to discover. Don't cry. Jack lovingly embraced Allison by the shoulders and gently pulled her closer. She nestled against his chest and burst into tears. I wish I never knew this, she said. Why did I decide to find out? Wait, he said, you haven't finished reading yet. There's something else written there. Allison sobbed and didn't lift her head from Jack's chest. It felt warm and peaceful there. she asked. "Can you please read it?" Jack didn't say anything but took the piece of paper and quickly scanned it, finding the point where Allison had stopped. "It says here that at the time of your parents' death, no relatives came forward to take you into their care," he said. "But Maria used her connections and found out that you had a grandmother, your mother's mother. Apparently, at that time, she either lived in another country or something, but she found out about her daughter's death too late. It seems she lost track of me. In any case, there's an address for her, and she currently lives in our city. To be more precise, in the suburbs." "I have a grandmother?" Allison asked in surprise. "It seems so. We could go see her. I don't know if I want to after all these years. If she wanted to find me, she could have. Perhaps she didn't know where to look, or maybe she had circumstances that prevented her from taking you into her care. You might be right. In any case, I'm scared. If you don't want to, you can simply tear up this letter as soon as I finish reading it." "Is there anything else written there?" "Yes, there is a little more left." Jack resumed reading, but for some reason, he read silently. Allison glanced at his face. He furrowed his brow, as if he couldn't believe what he was reading. He even rubbed his eyes. Then he skimmed the text again, looking at Allison with a thoughtful expression, as if trying to figure something out. What does it say?" Allison took the paper from him and read it herself, frowning. "There's an address here, and it's the address of the house where I lived as a child with my parents." "This is the address of this house?" "Yes. So, I lived here. This is the house where I grew up, where my parents lived until their death." Jack shrugged, looking bewildered. "It seems so. But how is such a coincidence possible?" "I don't know, but I remembered a few details just now. When I moved in here, they didn't really tell me who had lived here before. They mentioned some family, but I didn't know what happened to them. I remember they either sold or gave away all their belongings. There was only one box left with some photos and things like that. I couldn't bring myself to throw it away and put it somewhere in the back of a closet. I never opened it, but maybe I should have. Anyway, I'll go get it now." Jack left, leaving Allison alone with her thoughts. This envelope had been sitting forgotten with her for several months, and inside it held her entire life. "Here," Jack said, placing a large dusty box in front of Allison. Together, they began carefully unpacking its contents into the light. Leo, who had been sitting in his playpen all this time, sneezed from the rising dust cloud, and Allison rushed to get water and some cloths. Together with Jack, they spread out and cleaned everything from the box: photographs, childhood drawings, notebooks. Allison examined them, realizing they were all about her. There were pictures of her parents on the porch of the maternity ward, and there she stood in a playpen, almost like the one Leo was in right now. Her mother held her from behind, while her father seemed to be the one taking the photograph. Unnoticed by Allison, tears silently rolled down her cheeks. Jack got up, fetched a pack of tissues, handed one to Allison, and then sat beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulder and gently patting her. "Thank you," Allison finally said. "I'm glad I decided to find out everything." "Well, I think it's for the best," Jack replied. "I've also decided to visit my grandmother." "Great, we can go tomorrow. And it seems I've figured out why I've been dreaming of this house." "Yes, now I've been thinking the same thing." Allison decided to visit her grandmother, named Anna, together with Jack and Leo. Although they hadn't yet discussed their feelings openly, something had subtly changed between them after the events of the previous evening. "I'm really glad I'm going with you," Jack said. "It will make me feel better." "I feel better with you too," Allison replied. Little Leo didn't say anything. He simply stared out of the window throughout the journey and occasionally pointed at things with his tiny finger. The address given in the letter led them to a small but very cozy summer cottage village. Although it was evident that the place had been built a long time ago, all the houses were well maintained. A quick glance was enough to tell that the owners frequented this place and enjoyed spending their time here. They soon found the right house, a large and cozy brick house surrounded by a well-kept garden. Allison rang the doorbell. "Yes," came a pleasant female voice. "I'm sorry," Allison said. "Are you Anna?" "Yes, I am. My name is Allison, and I've come to see you about a personal matter." "All right, Allison, I'll open up now." A couple of minutes later, the door cracked open, revealing a tall, stately woman in her 60s. You couldn't exactly call her a grandmother. The way she carried herself made it seem as though she were royalty. Despite being at a summer cottage, she was dressed in fashionable light-colored trousers, a light blue blouse, and a strand of pearls around her neck. "I'm all ears," she said. Allison froze for a few seconds, then gathered her courage and said, "I'm Allison, your daughter Lucy's child." Anna paused, then gasped and clutched her chest. Allison was frightened, but the woman quickly regained her composure. "I'm sorry," she said firmly. "I don't have any heart conditions. It's just a habit. And who is this with you?" "This is Jack." Allison hesitated for a few seconds but decided that since their relationship wasn't clear yet, she'd simply introduce him as my father-in-law. "And this is Leo, my son." Anna looked at the little boy that Jack was holding in his arms and smiled warmly. "So, I'm already a great-grandmother. Come on inside." She gestured for them to enter, leading them down a wide stone path to a cozy little porch. There was a white wooden table and a few chairs that matched. "Please, have a seat," she said. "I'll put on a kettle." She returned in a minute and sat down, wiping her hands with a white waffle towel. "Excuse my excitement," she said. "How did you find me?" "Through the director of the orphanage where I grew up," Allison said. "Oh my goodness," Anna exclaimed. "Tell me everything from the beginning." Allison recounted everything she could remember. How she grew up in the orphanage, got married, had a child, and eventually decided to find out about her parents and ended up with Anna's address. The woman listened attentively, not interrupting, and occasionally fiddled with the edge of her towel. When Allison finished, she sighed and said, "Oh my dear, what you've been through." Allison nodded. "I was very afraid to come here," she confessed. "I thought maybe you wouldn't want to see me." "Oh," Anna said. "I lost you back then." She started crying and quickly got up. "Forgive me, I'll go fetch the teapot." She disappeared into the house. Allison exchanged glances with Jack, handed Leo to him, and followed her grandmother. Inside, she silently approached the crying Anna and embraced her. In response, Anna hugged her granddaughter tightly. After a few minutes, they both calmed down, took the teapot, cups, a bowl of cookies, and some candies, and returned to the porch. Jack and Leo were already wandering around the garden. "Your mother was a strong-willed woman," Anna said. "Do you remember her?" Allison asked. She shrugged, vaguely, and I can't be sure if it's actual memories or just my imagination. Anna nodded thoughtfully. "I believe we have a lot of time ahead of us, and I'll have plenty to tell you. By the way, do you know what your grandparents did for a living?" "No," Allison replied. "Internationally renowned translators of the highest caliber. We were constantly traveling, met at an international conference, and soon after, your mother was born. I took some time off from work, but your grandfather continued to travel. However, I missed the romance and the journeys terribly. So, when your mother grew up, I returned to my profession. Perhaps that was a mistake. We, as parents, were often absent from her life, and she quickly became independent. When we tried to tell her something she didn't like, Lucy never listened and did things her own way. I never imagined her like that. Oh yes, your mother was quite the stubborn one. We wanted her to follow in our footsteps. Well, either become a diplomat or a journalist. But she decided she wanted to be a teacher. Did you argue because of that?" Anna's face turned sad. "Unfortunately, yes, very often. We were also strongly against her marriage to your father. Why? Looking back now after all these years, I can't even explain it to myself. Some kind of parental stubbornness, perhaps. Despite the conflicts, my husband and I both believed that our daughter was the most beautiful girl in the world, deserving of at least a prince or a prime minister. Well, many parents are like that, and these ambitions hindered us from understanding that she could be perfectly happy with just a good person, like your father. Did you know him?" "Very little, unfortunately. Anyway, when Lucy announced that she didn't care and that she would marry him anyway, we had a terrible argument. Carl, my late husband and your grandfather, shouted in anger that she was no longer his daughter and that she should never dare to cross the threshold of our home again." Anna fell silent. It was evident that she was making every effort not to cry again, and she succeeded. "I still remember her face," she continued. "She said, 'Fine, be that way. She'd rather have no parents than monsters like you.' And she left." "Left home?" "Yes. She went to your father. Soon after, they got married, and then you were born. Did you reconcile?" "Unfortunately, The worst part is that Lucy made a couple of attempts. She sent us some photos of your family. There you were as a little girl. First from the maternity hospital, then getting bathed, and then in the playpen. Carl forbid me from responding. He said he wouldn't back down from his words. That's terrible. Yes, he was a cruel manual. He liked things to be the way he said. However, I must admit, I'm just as guilty. I could have easily gone to visit my daughter, son-in-law, and granddaughter on my own. But I didn't. You've never seen me before. Today is the first time. My husband and I were completely absorbed in our work. We were seasoned professionals by then. You could say we were hardly ever home, and we rarely saw each other. Both of us were on business trips. He was in Australia, I was in Canada. He went to China, and I went to Mexico. Wow. Yes, work is the only thing your grandmother can be proud of. But work, to some extent, became our downfall. There was a terrible series of events. I was at a conference in Madrid when I received a call informing me that Carl had passed away. What a nightmare. Yes, at that moment, he was in one of the Central African countries. He occasionally had problems with his gallbladder. He needed examinations and medication, or even surgery, but he was stubborn. He considered it nonsense and weakness. He took painkillers by the handful and never missed a single working day. Anna frowned, and Allison noticed that her left eyebrow curved slightly differently than the right one, with a slight upward tilt at the outer corner. Both Allison and Leo had the same feature. She had noticed it in other people. It made her smile, and her grandmother continued. Of course, this couldn't go on indefinitely. As I mentioned earlier, when he was on a business trip in one of the Central African countries, he was struck by something specific. I don't know the exact details whether help couldn't be provided or didn't arrive in time, but Carl died. Allison gently took her grandmother's hand, and she nodded in gratitude. Of course, I flew there, and it all began. There were so many issues with retrieving his body. I got stuck there for a long time. I won't recount the hell I went through. So many years have passed, but I still get chills thinking about it. Oh, Grandma, Allison said, I feel so sorry for you. But it turns out that was only the beginning. When I finally got back to our homeland with my husband's body, an even more dreadful piece of news awaited me. I learned about Lucy and Reed's deaths. Allison swallowed. She imagined what this woman sitting across from her had gone through. She suddenly thought that it would be like something happening to Jack and then Leo right after. Such thoughts made her feel sick, and she focused on her grandmother's voice. A lot of time has passed, so I missed my own daughter's funerals. I somehow managed to arrange my husband's funeral, utterly broken, and only then did I start finding out what had happened to you. That's when the trail went cold. No one knew what had happened to Allison Miller. I called hospitals, orphanages, filed various reports, wrote to different agencies, all in vain. Allison interrupted her. Wait, you said Miller Allison? Yes, that's your father's last name. Lucy took it, so naturally, it became your last name. Allison nodded. It seems like everything is clear now. In the orphanage, I was always under the name Smith, so you couldn't find me. The woman smiled. Today is the happiest day of my life because you found me on your own. How did you live afterward? After Mom and Grandpa's death? Anna sighed. I don't know how I didn't go insane. Although, I do know, work was the only thing I had left. I worked, traveled, moved from country to country until my health allowed. I tried not to stay anywhere longer than a few months. Always new places, people, landscapes, impressions. It was a constant escape from my terrible past. I only retired a year ago, though I could have done it a long time ago. That's when I moved here. Did you buy this house? No, it has always belonged to our family. Your grandpa and I bought it when we were young, but we hardly lived here, and then I remembered it and decided to return. I hired people, renovated the house, fixed it up, cleared the garden, and I thought I would quietly live out my old age. Quiet and alone won't be the case anymore, Allison said with a smile. And I'm incredibly happy about that, Anna said. The whole family stayed overnight. Jack put Leo to bed, and he had already gone to sleep. After it got dark, the grandmother and granddaughter moved into the house, to the kitchen, where they sat and talked until morning. So, Jack, who is he? Annie asked at some point, squinting mischievously. Allison blushed. He's Alex's father, my almost ex-husband. And you are living with my grandson. It's temporary. It's just more convenient for now. Very kind of your former father-in-law. There's nothing between us. It seems like both of you want there to be. Grandma. I must remind you, young lady, I'm a great-grandmother. They laughed. Anyway, Anna said, of course, it's not my business, but I can see from the outside that there's something between you and Jack. Think about it and I'll go to bed. She left Allison alone. Allison was happy to have some time to think, but her head felt heavy after a sleepless night. Allison climbed the stairs to the room prepared for them. The dawn was already breaking outside the window. She saw her son sleeping peacefully in the center of the bed, his arms and legs spread out childishly. On the other side of the bed, Jack was sleeping. His face looked so relaxed, familiar, and comforting that Allison couldn't help but smile. She always felt safe with him. She gently settled down on the other side of her son and quickly fell asleep. Good morning, Allison heard. She opened her eyes and saw two pairs of eyes, both looking at her attentively. The first pair, blue eyes, belonged to Leo, who sat holding his favorite stuffed rabbit, a gift from Alex before he left. The second pair of blue eyes also belonged to Jack. He looked at her with great tenderness, and what was most surprising was that he didn't hide that look. It seems like it's already daytime. Allison replied. It's still a good morning for me, Jack said. For me too. Will you join us for breakfast? Anna is waiting for us. Sure. They all went downstairs together. Allison freshened up. Anna behaved as usual, as if she hadn't hinted yesterday that there might be something special between Allison and Jack. Did you get enough sleep? She smiled. Yes, it's wonderful to sleep in the fresh air here, Jack replied. Come visit us more often, as a family, Anna said casually. For some reason, Jack wasn't embarrassed, but instead smiled. Definitely, and you should come to us, Allison added. With pleasure. After breakfast, they exchanged phone numbers and took a bag of cherry turnovers for the road. I must be a terrible grandmother if I haven't baked cherry turnovers for my granddaughter all these years, Anna joked. Look, even a great-grandson has already been born. They remained silent throughout the drive home. Jack gazed mysteriously out of the window, seemingly lost in thought. When they returned home, he finally said, Well, Allison, it seems like it's time for us to talk. It seems so, Allison replied. He didn't seem to expect such determination from her and looked slightly startled. But to his credit, he quickly regained his composure and began. I won't beat around the bush. I'll just say it as it is. I love you, Jack. Don't interrupt. I love you, not as the mother of my grandson or as my daughter-in-law. You mean everything to me since the night you, pregnant and scared, appeared at my doorstep. My life has been divided into before and after since then. Before was just longing, darkness, alcohol, and despair. After was a tiny hope that I tried not to acknowledge for as long as possible. I told myself, don't interfere, old fool. Be happy that you can breathe the same air as her, eat at the same table, and see her almost every day. Jack. Allison, please listen. I won't have the courage to say this a second time for a long while. When you decided to rebuild your life with Alex, I decided to do everything not to get in your way. I thought you loved him. I suffered and felt jealous like a fool, but I believed it would be better for both of you. I even tried to dissuade him from going to the Far East. And then you calmly said that you had decided to part ways, and it was all for Leo. That was probably the happiest day of my life. Although every day I spend with you is happiness for me. And what's a day? Every minute. And now, maybe I'm going crazy, but lately, it seemed to me that I also matter to you. I don't ask for anything, just one word from you, and we'll both forget this conversation forever, as if it never happened. But if there is even a tiny drop of hope, I don't want to forget this conversation, Allison said firmly, looking into his eyes. I need to confess a lot to you two. Yes, I've known for a long time that I'm not indifferent to you, and I was scared. It felt somehow, I don't know, wrong. You've always been so kind, caring, and understanding. I felt safe in your home from the very first second. I thought such a thing couldn't exist. It seemed like I couldn't allow myself such happiness. But then, probably thanks to Alex, I realized that I could. It was the first step toward living the way I want. I started to listen to myself and hear myself. And yesterday, I talked to my grandmother and finally understood myself and what I want. Allison, Jack said in a hoarse voice. Am I dreaming this? Is this real? It's not a dream. And even if it were, didn't a dream bring me to you? He simply approached her, embraced her, and she realized that she would never feel lonely again in her life. If everything I've been through in this life had to happen for me to meet you, Jack whispered, I would go through it all again without a second thought. I hope all the terrible things we've both endured are behind us now. He gently sat in an armchair, drawing her onto his lap. I'm sure there are many bright days ahead of us. With you, Jack, in this house, every day will be bright and happy.